A man with an incredibly beautiful lady were in the bedroom, but outside it was already deep night and everyone in the estate was asleep. He extended his hand to Rosie and said that she had promised to help him, so he hoped that she would do just that. The girl at that moment stood a stunningly handsome man. He told her to move closer to him, and the girl could not do anything. She was delighted with his appearance. Smiling, the blonde guy said that if she moved closer, he would finally be able to touch her. Of course, Rose knew perfectly well that she absolutely should not fall in love with this man. But in the end, everything didn't turn out the way she expected. She thought that this time she could just hold his hand and nothing catastrophic would happen. As soon as she took his hand, this was not enough for the man. He looked into her eyes with his beautiful green eyes and asked if she really wanted to just hold his hand. Of course, it was all wrong. The girl was ready to throw herself into his arms. However, she restrained herself with force because she knew that it would be wrong. More than anything in the world, she would like to bring the night with him. However, Rosie stopped herself because even getting close to him would be a great disaster for her. All because this man was the main character of this world. But this would not be the biggest problem if Rosie were not the sister of the evil owner of the Magic Tower. So, she looked at him with her big, beautiful pink eyes and didn't know how she was supposed to even tell him about it so that he wouldn't end up killing her for it. The man, meanwhile, continued to approach her. He said that he was incredibly glad that he was not the only one who fell in love with her. Rosie, hearing this, was very surprised. She asked what exactly he meant. The man who had a naked torso suddenly stopped. Looking at her with concern, he asked, "Do you still not know how I feel?" And then Rose realized that he really meant everything he said. For her, it was a little strange, and she didn't know how to react to it correctly. In fact, they spent all the previous nights together, and he quite often said that he liked her, and that she was a beautiful girl, and everything like that. However, now she finally realized that every word he whispered to her turned out to be true. Until that moment, she thought that he was simply overcome with emotion, and he said all this without thinking. Rosie was actually absolutely sure that he was just caught up in the moment. However, now that he said it at a time when they were not doing anything like that, she realized that this was not the case. The man sat opposite her and suddenly frowned and said that he was not at all one of those people who say that he likes someone to a person whom he only considers as a one-night partner. Rosie, hearing this with a trembling voice, asked, "Does this really mean that he is seriously saying that this was not just an affair between them?" The man was, of course, angered by this phrase. He frowned and asked how she could even think that this could have been just a one-night stand. Because of this, the girl felt a little ashamed because she really thought so and could not even imagine that he did not think exactly the same. In fact, she felt so awkward that she was ready to cry. She looked at him with her big, cute eyes, and the man noticed that she was quite nervous. In the end, the man sighed heavily and said that this was their relationship and definitely not an affair for a few nights just to get away. Also approaching her closer, he said that since everything had already started, then in that case there was no way back. He began to extend his hand to Rose in order to show the truth of his intentions. Then the man approached her and was about to kiss her on the lips, but quickly changed his mind. He decided that it would be too much for her, so he just hugged her. In fact, this man had incredibly soft hair, and it was the color of moonlight. His eyes were clear and bright, like the best expensive emeralds. There was a man who was beautiful like a god. He looked at her from above. His gaze was full of adoration, and Rosie could not believe that he could really have such feelings for her. Continuing to hug her tightly, he whispered in the girl's ear in a quiet voice that from that moment on, only she had the right to hug him. Rose was shocked to hear this, but the man also said that he would always hug only her. Slowly, his head began to turn toward the girl's cheek. He began to gently shower her neck with kisses and said that from this moment on, she would also be the only one who would kiss him. Rose immediately felt incredible pleasure from these actions. The man continued to do this at the same time. He said that she could touch him as much as she wanted. Then she looked him straight in the eyes. The girl still hesitated. She didn't know if this would be the right decision. There were many different thoughts in her head that contradicted each other. But in the end, she still agreed. Then the man finally felt the very answer that he expected. So he gently began to kiss her right in. He had been waiting for this for a very long time, and now he was incredibly happy when he finally managed to do it. In fact, Rosie was a character in a very famous novel called The One and Only Duke. But she wasn't some important character to the story like everyone else. She was like a forgotten, insignificant doe who wandered into the thick of the forest. The girl was an insignificant secondary character who was reincarnated in this world. She assumed that her life would have no meaning. She ended up there 20 years ago and was already used to the fact that no one ever noticed her. However, Rosie did not know from the beginning that she was being reincarnated as a character from the novel, or that, as the villain's sister, she was to be killed by the protagonist because of her brother's crime. And so Rose had absolutely no idea why she remembered all this after so much time. Somehow the girl magically turned out to be a very small child, and remembering all this information, she was incredibly scared because now she understood what end ultimately awaited her. Rosie couldn't believe that this could really happen. She was incredibly scared. Her body was shaking with fear. She thought it was something incredible. At that very moment, her older brother was sitting not far from her. It was a dark-haired guy. He was sitting at his desk and pushing. However, as soon as he saw that something was wrong with her, he closed it. The boy quickly began to approach the Rose, and the girl at the same time thought that she could die on absolutely any day. She did not know the exact date when this could happen. And all this will happen not through her fault. She will not do anything like that in her entire life. It will happen because of her brother, who in the future was supposed to become a villain. The boy immediately turned to his sister in a rough voice and asked what was wrong. After all, she had stopped playing with her plush snake and was just looking at him with a surprised look. Rosie, of course, couldn't answer anything at the same time. She didn't understand what he expected from a 3-year-old child. After all, she had only recently learned to walk. Of course, all this incredibly irritated her and drove her crazy. However, she had to continue smiling so that the guy would not suspect anything bad. For a while, the brother just looked at her. After that, he decided to activate his magical abilities. He tried to pretend as if he didn't care about all this. At that moment, the girl's snake rose up and he placed it right into Rose's hands. It now sparkled much brighter and was completely different to the touch. The girl, seeing this, was not at all surprised because this was to be expected from the main villain of the story. This talent was truly terrifying because he was still at a young age and already had the similar abilities. It was very surprising to her to realize the fact that her brother used gravity distortion magic so easily, as if it cost him nothing. In fact, this evil beret was 4 years older than Rosie, and one day he was supposed to become the young master of the tower in history. This man was supposed to spread chaos throughout the world and eventually be defeated by the main male characters of the story. And after her brother had to kill this beautiful tall blonde guy, the next in line was supposed to be Rosie. Even at a young age, the girl understood that incredible danger awaited her in the future, but she did not know how she could prevent all this. Of course, her brother eventually dragged her down, and she didn't want to die just because he wanted to take over the world. Of course, Rosie initially thought that she was born with a silver spoon in her hands. However, it turned out that it was simply gilded. Rose was well aware of the fact that if the whole story followed the original plot, it would definitely come to an end soon. So she wondered how she would be able to survive all of this. From the novels she read in her past life, she somehow ended up in a romantic fantasy in which she also had to survive because of her villainous brother. She noticed the fact that her brother quite often read various magic books. Even scientists fought against all this as if it meant nothing. But Rosie didn't understand how she was supposed to confront this man as a 3-year-old little child. Then suddenly her brother noticed that she couldn't stop looking at him, so he asked why she was looking at him with such a hungry look. He asked if she would like to have lunch already. Later at that very time, she kept thinking about how she was supposed to change the thinking of such a sociopath as this person. The girl understood that she definitely would not be able to do this, so in the end she simply decided to give up. She thought that the most beneficial thing for her in this situation was to simply die quickly. So she got very angry and hit the boy with the snake and thought that he would just kill her, and that's it. This snake hit both the brother's face and fell to the ground. Then he looked at her with an incredibly evil look. His evil insides were already in the boy. As soon as Rosie saw this look, she thought that after this he would definitely kill her, and she herself really hoped that he would do it quickly and without pain. For a while she just sat with her eyes closed and hoped for the best. But when after a few minutes nothing happened, she finally took the courage to open her eyes. But as soon as she opened her eyes, she was a little surprised because the boy just stood and silently looked at her. Rose didn't understand why he had such a reaction. But then the guy on the road turned to her, smiled happily, and asked if she really wanted to learn gravity distortion magic as well. Of course, the girl didn't want this at all. She just dramatically threw a toy in his face, that's all. So she didn't understand why he even assumed that she wanted to study some kind of magic. But her brother, meanwhile, sat down next to the girl and said that she really was his sister, and that she, of course, also had the tasks of a genius, so he was ready to help her. Then the guy put aside the toy and the book he was reading, and Rose herself tried to understand what kind of delusion he had. But as soon as he sat her on his lap, the girl did not resist. The guy said that since she has the genes of a genius, it should be easy for her. So he took the book he had read before and opened it. Rosie immediately began to look at all these incomprehensible symbols that were depicted in the book. She understood perfectly well that they definitely did not bode well. She turned her gaze to her brother and thought that this madman definitely didn't know anything about children. She didn't understand how old he thought she was, since she was waiting to read a book. It is quite obvious that Rosie will not be able to even visually make out anything there, let alone understand the meaning of what was written there. However, the guy asked her to at least try. Rosie, sighing heavily, began to run her finger along the lines and read that the gravitational distribution consisted of the necessary foundations of mana control. As soon as the girl heard her own voice, she was very amazed. She could not believe that she could actually read it herself. Then she thought about what this meant, that she was a genius, because at that age no one reads. And her brother himself was incredibly amazed that she was able to actually read all these sentences. He looked at his sister in a new way and said that she was a genius after all. But Rosie was very scared at that moment because it also meant that she had somehow managed to pass her brother Adrian's first test. The girl decided that this did not bode well. Despite the fact that he looked cute, in reality he was a real monster as well. She noticed that for some reason he was very happy when he saw that she was able to do it. Rose suggested that perhaps she was the same genius as he was. After all, after the incident with the 3-year-old child who was reading the magic tome, he began to take her everywhere so that she could see the world. One fine evening, they went to a place unknown to Rosie. It was already getting dark outside, and they were standing opposite some hills. The girl was in Adrian's arms and looked at all this with incredible surprise. In fact, this building really was very powerful and magical to some extent. The biggest thing is that Adrian told his father that he would take on her magical education. Of course, the man was very happy because he believed that Rosie herself would like to learn this from him. Adrian was incredibly proud of himself then. He said that of course Rosie wouldn't mind if he taught her because she loved him. Well, the girl was very shocked when she heard this answer from her brother. She did not understand why he even said something like that, because it was all only in his imagination. The father then came closer to Adrian and said that the video showed how close the two of them had become. He was really very pleased that they had established a relationship with each other because it was very important. After this, the man said that she was really ready to leave the education of the Russian in his hands. He trusted his son, so he hoped that he would cope with his new responsibility. The girl, of course, was not happy about this at all. She thought that this was not the kind of training from the villain that she would like to receive. Of course, she could not express her opinion, so no one asked her. After talking with his father, Adrian took his sister in his arms and they began to leave. The girl at the same time thinking about how she really didn't like the fact that her brother was a villain, because it made her life much more difficult. She thought that if things don't go as she was staggering, then in that case she could definitely go up against her brother for the sake of her own salvation. She even thought that as soon as she grew up a little and gained strength, she would make him her own footstool, because that was the only thing he deserved, considering the evil thoughts he had. And so Rosie began to lay down her secret life as Adrian's dear little sister who was hidden from everyone in the magic tower. One beautiful summer day when she turned 20, she thought that she could no longer live like this. She wanted some changes for herself. She decided that she definitely wasn't going to spend this summer in the tower. She needed fresh air and new feelings for herself, so she went straight to her brother, who was sitting in his office and sorting through some papers. As soon as Rosie ran to him, Adrian immediately tore his gaze away and looked at her with surprise. He did not understand why she came without warning. At that time, the man was 24 years old, and as soon as the girl entered his office, she said that she had heard that he was heading south to identify demonic beasts. And for this reason, she said that she would go with him. But in fact, as soon as Rosie entered his office, she opened the door so hard that they even broke behind her. During all these years that she lived in the tower with her brother, the girl learned magic so much that it became incredibly strong, and sometimes it was a little difficult for her to control her abilities. Laughing nervously, she turned to her brother and said that his door was incredibly flimsy, and she also advised him to choose a more durable material in the future, since in this way one could even get hurt. Well, Adrian ignored it because it wasn't the first time he had to replace doors. Then he asked the girl if she really wanted to explore demonic beasts with him. Rosie quickly approached him and said that this was not so at all. She just wanted to relax in the villa. She needed to be in the tower all year round, and she was already tired of it. Adriana didn't answer. Then the girl continued to insist on her own and said that last summer he also couldn't allow her to go. So she really hoped that at least this time he would allow her to do it. Her brother thought seriously about this request for some time. Then, sighing heavily, he finally agreed to take her with him. Rosie, hearing this, was very surprised. She immediately smiled happily and thanked her brother for permission, because it was really necessary and important to her. She said that she loved him very much and appreciated that he actually allowed her to do this. Adrian was very shocked as soon as he heard these words. The man was embarrassed. His ears even turned red. After that, he said that in fact, despite the fact that he allowed her to go, she was only allowed to stay at the villa. He asked if she understood in that case that she was forbidden to go beyond its boundaries. Rosie smiled and said that she understood everything, so he did not have to worry. But the man also said that he would order the summoned beast to guard her instead of the servants so that everything would be exactly reliable. And in the end, they really did go to that lucky villa. But at that moment, Rosie couldn't even suspect who exactly she would meet in that place and how her life would develop further. On the very first day, as soon as they arrived at the villa, Rosie saw the ocean and she was really very happy because before she had never seen it in real life. For a long time she was on the beach. The girl even built a sand castle because she needed to somehow entertain herself. After that, Rosie sat on the shore and saw one beautiful shell that had a dented side. However, she liked it incredibly much. And from that moment on, several hours passed. Rosie was on the beach all this time when the sun had already begun to set. She ran up to her brother and said that she was already quite hungry. Meanwhile, brother, having already finished working, was sitting on a small piece of sand, reading his books as always. As soon as the man saw that Rosie ran up to him, he immediately looked at her. The girl stood in front of him in an incredibly beautiful white seraphim. She adjusted her long pink hair and suggested that he go to dinner already because she was very hungry. Meanwhile, Adrian put the book aside and asked where she always put her shoes, since she was standing on the sand completely barefoot. Rosie immediately jumped up and down and said that she didn't know. She had completely forgotten where she had left them, so she was without them. Then suddenly Adrian came closer to her and took the girl in his arms. He said that he had prepared shashlik, so he asked her to be patient a little, and then she would be able to eat well. The girl, hearing about this, said that she was, of course, happy about the shashlik. However, she wanted to eat immediately. In the end, Adrian said that he was going, in which case it was just necessary to be patient until they reached the villa, and then she would eat. She was very happy, but she thought that if this was the original Adrian from history, he would have kicked her out a long time ago and scolded her for such whims. Of course, the girl was still a little scared because she knew what this man was capable of. However, he had changed a lot and was completely different from the original story. He hadn't done anything terrible yet. For this reason, Rosie believed that this could be considered a successful rehabilitation. On his part, she really hoped that everything would continue in the same spirit. Tomorrow morning, Hadrian was to set out on a ship to fulfill the emperor's request to subdue a special beast. And this meant that the entire villa would be at the complete disposal of the girl without Adrian. Of course, she would be very lonely. However, she thought that this was not the worst thing, because she would finally be able to be free. Rosie was really looking forward to it, because this would be her first free weekend away from everyone. She had never had anything like this before. However, that same night, Adrian warned her in advance that if she created any problems, he would put her back in the tower for 10 years and would not be able to give her any days off. The next morning, Rosie woke up early to accompany Adrian. She hugged him and told him to take care of himself and to drive very carefully because she was worried about him. The guy even smiled a little And as soon as Rosie noticed this, she immediately felt very pleased, because it wasn't often that you could see a smile on his face. She thought that he found it very funny that she told him to take care of himself, because he was a man and he himself was perfectly aware of what he was capable of. After smiling, Adrian said that she was the one who had to be careful, so she should be more concerned about her well-being than his. Adrian was the only owner of the magic tower that towered in the center of this world, so this person definitely did not need to be careful. Every man, beast, and animal in this whole world fell from his gestures and expanded under his feet. Rose thought that he was a truly terrible villain. However, at that moment, he suddenly patted his sister on the head goodbye. Before that, he also told her not to wander around uselessly and to stay only on the territory of the villa. Otherwise, she would regret that she had ever asked to come with him. As soon as the girl heard this and felt this gesture from his side, she immediately felt unpleasant. She could not believe that he really stroked her head like a dog. But she didn't tell him anything about it. Rosie just smiled and told her brother that he shouldn't worry. The territory of the villa was quite enough for her, so she didn't understand why she needed to go anywhere else. Adrian still listened to her after that. He began to head to the carriage before that he looked back and saw that his sister was waving goodbye to him. The girl was incredibly happy that he was leaving because it meant freedom for her for about a month. After all, that was exactly the period for which the guy was leaving the villa. In the end, immediately after Adrian left, the girl returned back to the villa grounds. And as soon as she entered the room, she suddenly saw that some not very big wolf had followed her. This creature rubbed against her legs as a greeting. She thought that this was precisely the same summoned beast of Adrian. She could not believe that he really had to follow her everywhere now. She thought about what she should do with this sticky pest now, but then suddenly she stroked this creature, and it felt good. So she assumed that perhaps they would not have a difficult relationship. Rose assumed that under such conditions, her best course of action would be to bribe him and win him over to her side, and that was exactly what she intended to do. She knew very well that the summoned beast really loved the high concentration of the manosphere. For them, it was like sweet cotton candy. They were truly ready to do anything for it. At that moment, Rosie, using her magic, conjured a small circle that immediately interested the creature. She thought that manospheres were very easy to make, so she definitely shouldn't have any problems taming this creature. As soon as the creature saw this circle, it immediately began to whine. The girl turned to him and asked if he would like to receive it. However, she did not give it to him right away. She said that it would be too expensive to just give him such a wonderful treat, so she was not going to give it to him so easily. As soon as the magical creature heard this, it immediately became very upset because it wanted to get this delicacy so much. But Rosie, seeing this reaction, was a little surprised. She couldn't even imagine that her brother had actually made not a wolf, but a dog. But in any case, she threw these thoughts away from herself and thought about what she could give him. This ball. However, she had one condition for this. The girl stroked the dog's cheeks and said that from that moment on, wherever she went, no matter what she did, no matter who she met, he should not tell Adrian anything without approving it. First with Rosie herself. She also said that if he agreed to fulfill these conditions, then in this case he would receive manospheres throughout the years. The girl asked if he agreed to such a condition. The dog, as soon as she heard this, was truly delighted. Of course, she agreed to these conditions because magical creatures really love the manospheres. As soon as the girl saw that he agreed to these conditions, she immediately gave him this ball and said that she was very pleased to deal with him. After that, Rosie said that she was going to go to the store, asking if she would like a dog with her. He immediately barked in agreement, so the two of them went to the market. As they passed by various stalls, she noticed that they were selling fruit kebabs and asked her new pet if he would like some. However, Rosie immediately thought about the fact that he was still a dog, and she did not know at all whether such creatures eat fruit kebabs. Of course, the dog didn't like this at all, so he barked with a more violent intensity. Rosie immediately realized that it would be better not to give him this. After that, she looked up and noticed that the sky was starting to darken. This meant that it was going to start raining very soon. Then she looked at her outfit and noticed that she was definitely not dressed for the rain. The girl thought about what she should do, because she definitely couldn't catch a cold. Freedom was achieved for her by really hard work, so she had to take care of it and enjoy it to the maximum. Rosie was also very happy that she had worried in advance about the possibility of rain and bought an umbrella. So she walked around the market with her dog. She bought some fruits and even a bone for the dog. The girl also looked into one point with jewelry and began to pick out for herself. Rosie was incredibly happy to finally see normal people instead of madmen from the magic tower after such a long time. But soon it started to rain and even started to drip little by little. Rosie thought that she would have to go back soon because it was unknown how long he had to go. Soon the rain became much heavier and she immediately started running with her dog. Rosie thought that she knew this would happen, so she ran very quickly back to her villa, opening her umbrella before doing so. And when she was already near the gate, she suddenly stopped because she saw that something would prevent her from opening it. Looking more closely, the girl saw that a man was lying on the ground. He was clearly unconscious. All his clothes were wet, but she couldn't see the rings because he was lying head down. Rosie was incredibly surprised. She didn't understand who this man was, and most importantly, why he was lying in such a place in the heavy rain. She thought Dasha that perhaps this man was an escaped criminal. Her guard dog, meanwhile, frowned. He even began to twitch because he believed that this man could bring danger. The girl, meanwhile, could not understand at all how it could happen that of all the places around, he decided to choose the Hill family to lose consciousness in. Then she began to examine his appearance. Rosie noticed that he had light hair. He also looked quite tall. She guessed that maybe he was about 180 centimeters. She still didn't know whether she should have saved this man. After all, at this rate, he really could have gotten sick and quite seriously. Then, in order to check if he was alive at all, Rosie pushed him and finally the man turned over face up. However, when the girl saw what he looked like, she was very surprised because she had already seen this face once. She couldn't clearly remember where exactly. However, the feeling of familiarity didn't leave her. The girl also couldn't understand how this person could be so handsome. Yes, Rosie looked at her companion, namely the dog, and noticed that he looked incredibly angry. She understood that he clearly did not like this man. She knew that Adrian's spirit could detect people who were hostile towards its owner. This meant that this person was somehow familiar with Adrian. Yes, and I seriously immediately became interested in who this man was. She thought that it was definitely the face she had seen before, and therefore began to go over all her acquaintances in her head. Then Rosie finally remembered she had seen this man at the banquet at the Imperial Palace that took place 4 years ago. Rosie was on the sidelines because no one knew her there, and her brother wouldn't be thrilled if she started talking to someone. The girl was on the balcony and saw that tall, fair-haired man. In fact, even then, despite being far away, he sat so brightly in order to blind her. And then suddenly, Rosie thought about what this wonderful man could be. And then one thought came to her mind that he was the main male character of this story. This was the man who would kill her and her brother, and in principle, the entire family. He was the sworn enemy of their entire family, and Rosie, having understood this information, was seriously frightened. In fact, it was a widely popular romantic fantasy novel called The Duke's Only Partner. In this story, Sierra was a beautiful commoner with sacred power, and she met the only Duke of the Empire, Ruvilian Rashian, and they formed a pretty strong relationship that was based on a contract. It was a romance in the style of first a contract and then love. He had such an irresistible charm that even the boring cliches seemed quite fresh when the girl read this novel. He had spiritual despair, and it was like a basic temptation. He saw only the heroine before his eyes. She was his one and only love, without whom he could not imagine his life. In fact, he was such a wonderful character that the girl's preference for the novel even caused small butterflies to appear in her stomach. However, this main male character had incredible self-confidence and was used to the fact that most things belonged to him, and even concerned people. Despite the fact that he was a virgin who had never even hugged a girl in real life, he used techniques that made the main character literally cry with pleasure. And that is why in her previous life, when the girl read such moments, she herself screamed throughout the entire apartment from happiness and joy. She really liked this character incredibly much, and now that she got into this world, she met him in real life. Rose thought that she probably hit her head on the bed frame and died. This was at least her last memory from her past life. After that, she opened her eyes and found herself already in this body. But in any case, be that as it may, the girl could not bring their sworn enemy into the family. She understood that doing so would definitely be wrong. But at some point, Rose thought that she could do it because he was too attractive and hot. She couldn't just take and let this beautiful man die because she would pass by. So using her magic, she lifted this man up and in a quiet voice she said that he could thank his sweet face because it was the one that saved him this time. The dog was not at all happy about this. He immediately began to growl and bark. However, Rosie turned to him and told him to behave quietly, otherwise she would not give him the monoball. After she entered the estate, she immediately took off the man's wet shirt so that he would not get sick, and then lit the stone. The girl also understood perfectly well that she had to take off his pants too. However, she did not understand how to do this because it was too intimate and it seemed wrong to her. After that, she examined his body and noticed that it was incredibly pumped up. Rosie couldn't believe that she actually saw all this live with her own eyes. The girl had never been attracted to such muscular men before. However, now that this man was lying right in front of her, completely shirtless and with his beautiful torso, she simply could not take her eyes off him. Rosie also thought that if she saw him often enough, she would eventually be able to fall in love with him because he was definitely her guardian. Because of this, the girl was quite worried, but she decided that she still needed to move on to the pants. After all, that way he would definitely get sick. She reached out and wondered how she was supposed to take them off. And at one point, Rosie thought that maybe it would be best to just leave his pants and underwear on. She thought that it couldn't cause too much harm. However, she also understood the fact that it might make him even colder. After that, Rosie suddenly thought that she could just use her magic and undress him and put new dry clothes on him using her directly. This is exactly what the girl did. She was also pleased by the fact that she could do it calmly without even using her hands. The Duke was too handsome, so she definitely would not have been able to withstand all this. To begin with, Rosie was going to use a t-shirt to enchant his lower body and put a shirt on him first. But in reality, using such magic was an advanced level. However, she had easily mastered it a long time ago. After everything was done, the girl looked back to check if everything was okay. And as soon as she turned around, she saw that the man's upper body was already dressed in a white, clean, dry shirt. After that, she turned her attention to the bottom and saw his prickly legs. However, fortunately, she used magic to cover her intimate parts with a towel. The girl breathed a sigh of relief. However, Rosie thought that these muscles were really incredibly strong, and the shirt was so short that it looked more like a dress on him. This made her feel a little funny and she smiled. But after that, the girl bent down lower and realized that she couldn't put underwear on him. Rosie really hoped that there would be no problems with this, and she was also going to take him to the bedroom on the first floor, of course using magic, because the man was incredibly heavy to carry on his own. After the girl put him to bed on the first floor, she turned to him asking if he could hear her. Meanwhile, she prepared a strong medicine for the heat for him and asked him to open his mouth. To take it, she held out a spoonful of rye and he still did not resist. Rosie was happy because he had been lying out in the rain for quite a long time and he had caught a fever for himself, but she was also very embarrassed when she gave him medicine because his beauty was truly downright killer. But while the girl was giving him the medicine, she accidentally spilled it on his face and reached out to wipe it off so as not to cause him more discomfort. At that moment, Ruvelian intercepted her hand. He grabbed her by the wrist. The girl did not expect this at all, and because of this, she was a little scared. Despite the fact that the man was in a weakened state, he acted quite quickly. He grabbed the girl by the hand and pulled her closer to him. Now Rosie was above the man. For a while they lay in complete silence. Rosie could feel his hands touching her shoulders. She was very worried. The girl did not understand at all what was happening. But the man then opened his beautiful emerald eyes and seeing her said in a very quiet voice that she saved him. Despite the fact that the man was practically unconscious, he remembered this. And even without paying attention to the high temperature, he was still able to say these words. Rosie, who was still in shock at the time, said that she simply couldn't leave him there. So it was obvious that she saved him. But the man continued to press her body closer to himself. He said that if he had stayed under that huge storm, he would have definitely died over time. His nakedness became quieter and quieter due to the fact that he was losing consciousness. The man said that his condition at that time was quite bad. But Rosie, who never took her eyes off him for a minute, couldn't understand how someone in such a terrible state could continue to look so stunning. But then suddenly, after a short silence, Ruvelian said that he would like to know the name of the man who saved his life. So he asked if she could tell him her name. Rosie wondered at that moment if she could really tell him her first and last name without losing her life. Well then, the girl suddenly realized that even though she was Rosie, she really saved him, and maybe he would start to hate her family a little less given this factor. This meant that perhaps he would change his mind about Adrian as well. The girl believed that if she played everything right now, then perhaps she would be able to avoid the deadly ending. These thoughts flashed through the girl's head quite quickly. Therefore, sighing heavily, she nevertheless gave her first and last name. As soon as the guy heard this, he immediately said that he knew it. After that, he sat down and the girl continued to be in his arms. The man brushed the hair from her face and said in a quiet voice that this meant that it really was her. He didn't even take his eyes off her. His reaction was completely incomprehensible to Rosie. After a short silence, the girl said, "Do you really know me?" The man at that moment was very surprised that she asked stupid questions. He asked, how could he not know Rose Hill? After all, she was Hadrian's only younger sister and the princess of the Magic Tower. As soon as he said this, he immediately smiled at Rosie. Seeing this stunning smile, she became very embarrassed. She could no longer just look him in the eyes, so she turned away. The girl thought that her heart could really explode at that moment if she continued to look at him. But the man suddenly moved closer to her. Their lips were a couple of centimeters from each other. Ravelian asked in an incredibly sexy voice if she knew who he even was. The girl didn't answer for a while. She was a little surprised by the fact that he simply called her by name, because usually they addressed her as Lady Rosie out of formality. It was truly the first time that a man from the very beginning simply started calling her by her name, as if he was already used to saying it, as if he had always done it before. Rosie tried to move away from him in order to continue to keep herself under control. After that, she asked if it was true that he was Duke Ravelian Rashian. But the man, continuing to pull her towards him, said that this meant that she still knew him. Rosie then said that he was just something of a celebrity in their empire after all, so it would be very stupid not to know who he was. The man didn't answer. The heat even adorned his face because he had a slight blush that perfectly emphasized his expressive eyes. Rosie looked at him again. She was also very embarrassed and thought that he was really very beautiful, and seeing him in person was much better for her than reading a description of his appearance. And so the Ravelian finally turned to her and asked if it was true that they had only met once. Rosie said that it was certainly so. However, he was incredibly handsome and also one of those people that once you meet, you will never forget. The man, hearing this, immediately smiled. But one cow did not understand why he continued to smile at her so strangely. At some point, it even seemed to her that he was trying to seduce her. But she didn't want to deal with it right at that moment. The girl thought that first she just needed to get out of his embrace, and only after that, she could assess the situation sensibly. However, suddenly at that moment, Ravellana became even worse. He began to sweat heavily. He developed shortness of breath, and soon he simply lost consciousness, falling straight onto the girl. Rosie was able to hold him so that he wouldn't crush her. However, she didn't understand what was happening at all. She didn't immediately realize that he had gotten worse and that he had lost consciousness. She turned to His Highness and tried to wake him up. But in the end, she only heard his hoarse voice calling her by name. But this name sounded completely different. He decided to call her Rose. And as soon as the girl heard this, she could not believe that he decided to come up with a nickname for her. At some point, the girl even wondered if her character was really so close to this person that she simply couldn't remember it. But he knew. The man kept calling her Rose, and the girl felt very uncomfortable because of this. She didn't understand what to do and how to act in this situation. She tried to push the Duke away. However, he continued to hold on to her with his hands. In a trembling voice, he said that he really felt very bad, and it was hard for him to breathe. And at that moment, Rosia became very awkward because she began to think about various terrible things. But he just felt bad, and she had to help him and not think about the fact that he was pestering her. He simply formed names and nicknames as if it didn't matter. So she understood perfectly well that he was definitely not himself, because the Duke would never have done that. He always had to think about etiquette. She tried to move his head away from her shoulder and touched his forehead to check if the temperature had risen even more. Rosie asked where exactly it hurt, and she thought that his forehead was burning as if a fire had been lit there. She understood that this was very bad. Ravelian looked at her with an older look and said that the fever did not subside, and his whole body was incredibly sore. He said that he felt as if he was dying. The girl was very shocked to hear this. She could not understand what had gone wrong. After all, she had given him medicine and done everything possible. Rosie was really scared for the Duke. She asked him to tell her if he felt pain all over his body, as if he had the flu. The man thought for a while. Because of the high temperature, it was hard for him to get his bearings, and that's why it took him some time. In the end, in the same hoarse voice, he said that this is exactly how he felt, and this is what the girl was most afraid of hearing. She realized that he had a mana overload, and that was very bad. In fact, this story is called The Only Duke and His Other Half for a reason. In fact, it has such a name only because such mana overloads could only be resolved by the Duke's other half, and she was the main character of the story. In that case, Rose didn't understand why he decided to overload right in front of her and not in front of the main character. She thought that it should have happened much later. After all, they hadn't even met yet. And besides, they were actually in Adrian's bedroom. Rosie was incredibly scared. She didn't know what she was supposed to do now. This situation really complicated the already difficult situation. She thought that if everything repeated as in the original story, then there was only one way to calm the main character and make him survive. And this method consisted in the fact that it was necessary to reboot mana, and she could only reboot through physical contact between people. It was possible to start with something light, like hugging him. However, after that, it was necessary to move on to something deeper, like a kiss. However, Rosie thought that it was all very strange because she did not understand why all this was happening to her and not to Sierra, as was intended in the original story. All this made the girl incredibly wary. However, suddenly the man put his hand on her neck and asked in a quiet voice that Rose not go away and not leave him alone. The girl hearing this was very shocked. She realized that all this was real madness and knew that because of this, she would have serious problems. The man, meanwhile, began to approach her even closer. Their lips practically touched. Rosie thought that the stronger the reboot was, the more such people lose control over themselves. She knew that being alone with a man now was very dangerous, and that was the reason she did not leave him. Rouvillian continued to approach the girl and said that he had one request for him. Rosie was incredibly scared because she understood perfectly well what exactly he wanted. The man, meanwhile, looked into her eyes with his beautiful emerald gaze and asked if she could kiss him. Rosie had read the original story, so she knew perfectly well that if she ignored Rouvillian, the future magic inside him would just take and kill him. Of course, she didn't want to let such an incredibly handsome and sweet guy like him just go and die because she couldn't kiss him. Of course, she couldn't allow this at all. Rosie was really very scared. For some time, she didn't know what to answer him because she herself didn't know what to do. However, the main character's task in this story was to put his wild Maisie to sleep. And Rosie was only the younger sister of the tower's owner, so she was not sure whether she would succeed in all this. At that moment, she really regretted that the situation had turned out this way, and that she had somehow gotten involved with the main character of this story. The girl already realized then that this would definitely not end well. But the Duke continued to look at her with a very painful look and asked her to kiss him. He explained that he would really just die without her. They were incredibly close to each other. Roxy knew that if she wasn't careful, she would get seriously entangled with the main character, and she didn't want that. Looking him straight in the eyes, she asked him what his exact condition was. Was it hard to endure all this? The man then began to lose consciousness again. He fell into the girl's arms and said that he felt as if he was about to die. When Rosie touched his shoulders, she felt that they were as if burning. She already wanted to tell him something else. But the man interrupted her. He begged her to save him. Otherwise, he would really die. The girl didn't know what to do. She didn't believe that he could really die. However, she definitely didn't want to check this. He still had to meet the main character. They were supposed to fall in love at first sight and be the most romantic couple of all time. And in order for this to come true, Rosie had no choice but to fulfill his request. She thought that she no longer cared, so she agreed to kiss him immediately. The man, hearing this, was very surprised and asked if it was true that she meant that they would start with a kiss and not that it would just be a kiss. Rosie, hearing this, did not understand why he was saying this. She said in a surprised voice that she meant that it would just be a kiss. Sighing heavily, the Rouvillian said that for a start it really was possible to start at least with this, because he felt worse and worse each time. The girl was simply in a stupor for some time. She did not understand why she had the feeling that they were not talking about the same topics and understood each other differently. But be that as it may, Rosie still agreed to the kiss. So she touched her lips to his burning, plump pink lips. Eventually they came together in a kiss, and the girl thought that there was also another main problem with all of this. And the problem was that she couldn't even imagine how to kiss. After all, she had never done this before, and because of this, Rosie was very afraid and worried about doing something wrong. After their lips briefly touched, Ruvillian pulled away and looked into her eyes for a while, after which he took the initiative and began kissing her again. With slow movements, the man laid the girl on the bed and began to be on top of her. His face continued to burn from the heat. However, he still gave Rosie time to rest. The girl then asked in a trembling voice if they really should do this in a kiss. The Duke smiled happily and said that of course it was. Hearing how confident he was, Rosie got a little scared, but she didn't have time to say anything else to him because he started kissing her lips tenderly again. At that moment, she already began to doubt whether he really suffered from mana overload and whether he really felt bad, because at some point it seemed to her that everything was absolutely fine with him. In the end, their kiss lasted for quite a long time, and Rosie felt his magical energy flowing straight into her. Since her kiss was primarily to suppress the magic, the girl thought that they would stop after everything finally returned to normal, and he began to feel better. However, after Rosie felt his body cool down, she noticed that the man, for some reason, did not give any signal that he was going to stop at all. She was absolutely sure that his magic was now fine, so she believed that they could stop kissing each other, but for some reason the Duke did not do this. Then she decided to take the initiative into her own hands, pushed His Highness aside and turned to him. The man didn't really like the fact that he was interrupted. However, he looked at the girl with respect and asked what she wanted. Rosie had already started to suggest stopping. However, as soon as he heard the first words, he immediately understood what she wanted, so he began to kiss her again, thereby not allowing her to continue the sentence. She, of course, responded to his kiss. However, she mentally cursed the Duke. She did not understand that if at this rate he would soon simply eat her, her chastity was definitely in danger. Then Rose thought about the wonderful, incredibly beautiful and charming main character of this story. Rosie did not understand why he treated her like that. After all, somewhere nearby was the main character of this story, with whom he should have behaved in exactly this way. So she finally managed to stop him. She started hitting his chest with her hands so that he would stop already. But Ruvillian sat for a while and looked at her with an incredibly sad look. The girl did not understand why he was acting as if she had hurt him badly by doing this, because Rosie believed that he was no longer in pain, and therefore they should have just stopped. For some time there was a tense silence between the man and the woman. Ruvillian turned to her first and was about to say something, but she interrupted him. Rosie told him that that would be enough for now. She truly believed that he no longer needed her kisses to calm his fever. However, the Duke continued to look at her with a very pitiful look, took the girl by the hand and asked her to allow him to kiss her longer. He really wanted more, and you could see on his face how upset he was when she interrupted him. As soon as she looked away from him, she thought that this man was driving her crazy in every possible way. So she had to somehow get out of this situation. She explained to him that she considered this type of relationship wrong, but the man immediately asked why she had this opinion. Ruse tried to formulate her thought so that he would understand it correctly, and then she said that such relationships were simply too impulsive. The man stopped at that moment. He looked at her in surprise and asked if he could really arouse her impulses. The girl replied that this is exactly what he seemed to have done. Ruvillian, hearing this, immediately smiled happily. He was apparently really proud of himself as soon as he heard that he had managed to arouse some feelings in her. However, he still agreed with the girl and suggested that in that case they just kiss that evening in order to, so to speak, consolidate the result. Even when he was just looking at Rosie, the girls found it quite difficult to maintain self-control because he really was incredibly gorgeous and she didn't know what to do. So she tried to push away from him again and asked that in that case he go to sleep and gather strength, and she would go. After all, she still had some things that she needed to do. In fact, she wanted to go away because she understood that if she stayed longer, she might also fall in love with him. So she absolutely could not allow this to happen. Rosie got out of bed and started to run away. The man, meanwhile, remained sitting completely alone. He was very upset because he still hoped for something more or at least longer kisses. Rosie couldn't believe that he actually took her and kissed her like that and then ended up pretending like nothing happened. So before going out, she told him to hurry up and lick under the blanket because he got caught in the rain. So he needs to get a good rest and warm up his body. After that, she used magic to cover the man with a blanket, after which Rosie smiled happily and wished him good night, telling him to get well as soon as possible. After that, she turned off the light and left his room. The man spent some time simply thinking about the whole situations that had developed, and after that, he finally fell asleep. The next morning, there was a small camp in the forest. There were a lot of different people and also weapons. In this camp, there was one man. He was a knight commander, and his name was Squirrel. It was a tall, dark-haired, blue-eyed guy. He turned to his partner, who asked if it was already too late. Meanwhile, the man was polishing the weapon and said that he had said that he would return in a month, so they could just patiently wait for his return. His partner was a fair-haired guy. He said that the others had already stopped. It was very boring. They could not continue working without His Excellency. He also said that the others had about 10 broken bones during the fight with him, so he had better try to hold back a little. Otherwise, they wouldn't have a single healthy knight left in the pen. The second person was a member of the Knightly Order of the Squirrel. He stood up from his seat and said that this is why His Excellency is the man who can break his bones. He was the only one who was capable of this. And the man said that in fact he even liked it after that. He asked if it was true that this time he definitely had to return, given the weakness of the tower. He also asked if it was normal that he would not lose hope in this squirrel. Sighing heavily, he replied that at least this was the official reason, so he would not say more. After this, the man realized that he would not be able to get any information from the head of the knights, so he went to his other companions and asked if they wanted to fight him. Rosie, meanwhile, returned to the estate towards the evening of the next day. In fact, she went to the market to buy several outfits for the Rebellion. Since her brother took absolutely all of his clothes, she had to make do, so she bought new outfits, but she was going to bring them to him a little later. The girl was already dressed in pajamas. She thought that it was really quite dramatic for several days, and she also became interested in whether Ruleliana was sleeping soundly. She really hoped that he was okay because he really needed a good rest and to gain strength. Rosie was happy that this time they only had a rather drawn-out kiss, but she believed that the next time should not have happened at all. The girl was going to do anything to prevent this from happening. She had more than enough connections with the male main characters in her past life. She decided that she would never suffer from lovesickness again in this life. And if she got involved with this man, it was inevitable. So she was going to keep her distance from him. For some time, she stood by the window and tried to put her thoughts in order. But then the girl was going to just take a bath. She thought that this would calm her down and make her fall asleep faster. So, going into the bathroom, she took off her nightgown and wrapped her body in a towel so as not to freeze while she was getting wet. Rosie had already turned on the hot water to fill the bath and was about to go get a glass of milk from the kitchen. However, she didn't even have time to leave the room when suddenly someone blocked her way. At first, she didn't see this man's face because he was quite tall. However, as soon as she raised her head up, she noticed that it was indeed a Rebellion. The man was just in his robe, and when he saw the girl, he immediately smiled happily. And after that, he asked what she was doing in this place. He also asked why she still hadn't slept. Rosie, meanwhile, began to cover her body with her hands, even though she was still wearing a towel and it was tied tightly to her body. She was about to tell him something when suddenly the man began to come closer to her, and because of this, the robe began to flutter in different directions. She understood that he was still without underwear. Because of this, the girl became incredibly embarrassed. She didn't understand what to do. Therefore, she simply decided to look up so as not to see the forbidden parts of the body. The girl was about to turn around and move away from him in the other direction. However, she accidentally slipped. Fortunately, Rebellion had good reflexes and managed to grab the girl so that she would not fall onto the tiles. Then Rosie found herself quite close to him again. His robe was completely unbuttoned and untied, and because of this, she felt even more awkward. But the man turned out to be quite self-confident. He smiled happily and said that he woke up and couldn't fall asleep. So he decided to go and finally wash himself because he was sweating quite a lot because of the fever. After that, he asked her for forgiveness for deciding to use the bathroom without her permission, and the girl moved away from him. She said that it was very good that he decided to use the bathroom after all, after which he asked if he had really washed himself in cold water before. You see, she had to heat the water after him. The man, who continued to stand with his robe unbuttoned, said that he needed to cool down a little, and that is why he decided that a cold shower would help him with this. Rosie, with her eyes closed, turned away from him and asked him to put on at least some clothes anyway. The man didn't even cover himself with his robe. He only smiled. But Rebellion saw that she was still very embarrassed. So he said that he understood everything after which he replied that in that case, he would pass by her for his clothes so as not to embarrass her so much. After that, the man said that if she suddenly needed any help in taking a bath, but he didn't even have time to finish because Rosie immediately said that she didn't need any help. Because she couldn't even imagine such a situation, her voice trembled. She wanted the man to just leave as soon as possible, and she collected her thoughts. She found it hard to believe that he was actually just going to help her take a bath or something like that. But eventually, when the man walked out the door, she locked it behind him. The girl did not understand whether he really was the main male character. It seemed to her more that he was just some kind of beast who wore the mask of the main character. This man really scared her, but after she took a bath, the girl went to the kitchen to get some tea before bed. But for some inexplicable reason, the Duke constantly followed Rosie. He was still in his robe, but at least he had put on his pants. The man with a smile on his face followed the girl everywhere. She absolutely could not understand why he did this, and in the end, Rosie came to the conclusion that the main character probably just went crazy, and that was why he behaved like that. In fact, throughout history, the Hill family and the Raken have never gotten along with each other. And now Rosie, who was the daughter of the Hill family, accidentally picked up the Duke of Rahian, and accidentally she calmed his mana surge with a kiss. However, in the end, she came to the conclusion that the Duke had truly lost his mind because he was behaving in a way that was extremely strange and incomprehensible to her. She also understood perfectly well that his family would clearly not be happy to hear this whole story. Rosie really might even have to hide the main character from everyone because he could be dangerous to society. Well then, suddenly the man, continuing to follow Rosie, turned to her again. He said that it was all thanks to her that he really began to feel much better. And for him, this was very important. The girl actually wanted him to just leave her alone, so she smiled and said that she was very glad to hear that he was already feeling better. The man thanked her again, but he continued to follow her, getting closer and closer to Rosie each time, making her feel even worse. But then suddenly the girl did not notice the unevenness on the carpet, and because of this, she stumbled. She could not believe that she would start falling again. She did not understand why she was so clumsy. Well, fortunately, Ravelion was nearby again. He grabbed the girl by the hand and pulled her closer to him. He also began to cover her head so that if anything happened, she would not get hurt. For a moment, Rosie even held her breath, and they were so close to each other that she couldn't even take her eyes off him. This man was truly amazing. After that, she suddenly couldn't contain her emotions because they were really incredibly close to each other. So the girl nevertheless took the initiative into her own hands and kissed him on the lips again. Rosie thought that the reason she became like this was precisely because of this stunning man, and she thought that he would definitely not lead her to anything good. The man, of course, responded to her kiss. Rosie thought that now he should have let her go. However, of course, the man did not want this, so he was only glad that she took the initiative and allowed him to kiss. Rosie thought that she herself had already gone crazy. Since she had done this at all, she had problems within the family, and she was very worried about the fact that if Adriana knew about this, she would definitely not tolerate such a thing. But she still stopped this kiss because she thought about the fact that she still felt incredibly sorry for the main character, with whom Ravelion was supposed to be. But the man was not going to stop kissing, so he moved the girl's face towards his again and continued doing what they were doing. Soon Rosie realized that she couldn't do all this anymore, so she finally pushed him away from her. But Ravelion, looking into her eyes, only smiled and happily called her name. He ran his hand over her cheek, brushing the hair away from her face, and in a quiet voice, hugging the girl, said that she really did kiss him first. Rosie stayed in his arms for a while, but then she tried to get away from him, thinking that she had gone completely crazy since she had actually done that. Unfortunately, she couldn't even push the man away from her. He just continued to stand and hug her, which made her panic quite a bit. Soon she still managed to push him away from herself. Ravelion looked at her in surprise. He already wanted to ask Rose what happened, but he didn't have time because the girl spoke first. She asked him for forgiveness and said that she had been too impulsive. Therefore, she was very sorry that she had kissed him because she had not wanted that to happen at all. She also said that next time this would definitely not happen again. Thus, she assured him of this, including herself as well. However, Ravelion continued to smile his beautiful smile and said that, in fact, for him these feelings were not impulsive and he really liked everything. But the girl couldn't understand why he suddenly started laughing so abruptly. She hadn't done anything like that, but for some reason it made him laugh. But soon after Ruvilian finally calmed down, he moved closer to her again and said that it really brought him a sense of reward. Hearing this, the girl was very surprised. She already wanted to ask what it meant, but the man changed the subject and replied that she would soon understand everything herself. Rosie was surprised, but she couldn't say anything more because he said that it was already quite late and it was time for them to go to bed, otherwise their sleep would be unhealthy. The man also asked if he could carry her to the bedroom. Rosie, upon hearing this, immediately protested and said that this did not need to be done. She could get there on her own. This was exactly the answer the man expected. However, he still smiled and thought that she really was incredibly sweet. However, before leaving her alone, Ruvilian suddenly came closer to her and took several strands of her hair and sniffed them. After that, he kissed her hand and bowed, telling her to sleep soundly and also wished her good dreams. And so when the next morning came, Rosie woke up quite early. She thought that she should have gotten up first for her own good. The girl decided to do this because she didn't know what kind of trouble he could cause during this time. Therefore, as soon as Rosie woke up, she immediately ran to the exit. In the corridor, the girl saw her pet, who looked at her in surprise. I don't understand why the owner was so worried. Seeing him, the girl breathed a sigh of relief. She stroked her dog and was very glad to see him because it meant that Ruvilian was still sleeping. She also hoped that nothing strange had happened all night and everything was calm. In order to make sure that everything was okay, she still decided to open the door to his room, and then she saw that the Duke of Ruvilian was indeed lying peacefully and sleeping in his bed. She decided that it was time to wake him up, so she went to the bed and turned to the Duke and said that it was already morning, so it was time for him to wake up. She could assume that it would not be so easy to wake him up. So the girl touched his shoulder with her hand and shook him slightly in order to wake him up. The man, meanwhile, opened his eyes a little. Rosie was very happy that he finally woke up. She was about to remove her hand. However, she didn't have time. And all because the Duke suddenly grabbed her wrist and pulled her closer to him. Rosie couldn't stay still, so she fell straight onto his chest, which made the girl feel very awkward. And for a while, she didn't understand what to do. And when she was about to get up and leave, he suddenly turned over and found himself right above her. The man pressed her down with his hand and at the same time continued to sleep. The girl could not understand what kind of person he was, and also that he had rather strange habits in his sleep, because he still had not woken up. This made her very wary. She decided to take things seriously, so the girl started pounding his back with her little fist so that he would finally wake up and get off of her. Then the man really began to wake up. He opened his emerald eyes, and seeing Rose, he was very surprised. The man saw that she was very confused, but at the same time angry, and the girl was wearing only a nightgown, and because of this, he was quite embarrassed. The guy realized that he had done something wrong, so he moved away from her to the other side of the bed. He asked Rosie for forgiveness. He said that he was half asleep and therefore thought that it was just a dream. After that, he sat and awkwardly looked at Rosie. The man really didn't know what to do to make amends because he understood how uncomfortable it made her. The girl herself at the same time thought that he was so crazy that even when he was in a half-asleep state, for some reason he grabbed girls and dragged them into his bed. This certainly made her very wary. Rosie also thought that if she were not so easy to charm, it would be easier. However, this was unfortunately not the case. Even though he was so rude to her, Rosie thought that being so cute and handsome at the same time was really a crime, and she didn't like that this man had such an effect on her. When the way was finally clear, Rosie stood up and told him to go and wash up and have breakfast, and she also pointed to the side and replied that she had prepared clean new clothes for him so that he could put them on directly. The girl explained to the Duke that at that time she would be in the hall. The man did not respond to this. He only smiled, and after that he really went to do everything that was needed in the morning. But before leaving, Rosie said that after breakfast, they could both go to the sea and walk around there for a while to clear the air. The man, of course, did not object, so they both changed their clothes and went to the ocean. Rosie asked him on the way if he liked the dish she had prepared for breakfast. The man immediately said that it was indeed so. It was very tasty, and so he thanked her for it. But then he suddenly stood in Rosie's way and said that he was too engrossed in watching her to remember what it tasted like. However, he was sure that it was excellent and that she had prepared it. As soon as the girl heard this, she became very embarrassed. She did not understand what was wrong with this man and why it seemed to her that he was trying to flirt with her again. In fact, at that moment, she could barely restrain her desire not to go up and hug this man, and Rosie also did not understand for what reason he after that continued to just stand there sweetly and smile, complicating the situation even more. But in the end, she just thanked him for it, and they walked the rest of the way to the beach in complete silence because they both felt awkward talking about anything. Rosie just thought that maybe he was one of those people who like to smile quite often, and that was the reason he did it all the time. In order to break their awkward silence, she turned to the Duke and asked where he was looking so intently because the man really did not take his eyes off one point. Then suddenly the Rovelian said in a very quiet and rude voice that those idiots continued to watch her and whisper about something. The girl was very surprised to hear this and immediately looked around to understand who exactly he was talking about. Then Rosie noticed that there were several men nearby who actually glanced at her sometimes and then whispered about something in between. The girl just smiled happily at this and thought that they really could have been attracted by her beautiful face. She was happy that at least someone else noticed her beauty, besides this crazy man who was walking next to her. Rosie was also very happy that Adrian was not in this place. After all, if her brother had been there, he would have made a noise and tried to gouge out the eyes of these men so that they would not even think of looking at her side ever. This would make the girl quite worried and nervous, and she definitely wouldn't want to do this on vacation. However, at some point she suddenly felt a cold feeling near her, and then she looked at the Duke, who was looking at the men with an icy gaze, and she understood where the cold was coming from. Meanwhile, seeing his gaze, they could not restrain themselves and simply ran away in the other direction because they understood that he was one of those people who first just look and then definitely act. The girl herself, meanwhile, continued to stand in place and thought that she could not even understand what was happening. But ultimately, Rosie decided not to dwell on it too much. She thought that she could still enjoy the handsome face of the main male character and thought that was a very good bonus for her. Rose looked at him and smiled happily. Of course, Rebellion noticed this quite quickly and asked if she really liked his face. The girl, as soon as she heard this, also became embarrassed. She laughed nervously and said that of course she liked it, but she herself thought about the topic. Who in the world would not like it because he really was very handsome? Then Rose decided to flirt with him herself, and smiling happily, she said that the Duke's eyes were also looking at her, so she asked what he thought about her appearance. The man fell silent awkwardly. He didn't know if he should talk about it, so they walked in complete silence for a while. Rosie, meanwhile, was thinking that she herself was well aware that she was beautiful. However, she was curious about how she was perceived by a man with such exquisite taste as the main male character. That is why she asked this question. Well, the man continued to remain silent, and because of this, she was very worried. She could not believe that he hesitated so much because her face was not his type. She even thought that he was hesitating and trying to find a way to escape from answering this question because apparently he did not see anything beautiful in her that could be noticed. However, here suddenly Rebellion stopped. He looked the girl straight in the eyes and said that for him, she would always be an absolutely charming person. At that moment, he even took her palms in his, and thus they stood for some time maintaining eye contact. Rosie felt a little awkward. However, the man said that she didn't understand at all, and because of this, he thought it would have been much better if she had left him in the rain that evening and they had never met. Rosie didn't understand why he was saying these words at all, but Rouvellian suddenly put a smile on his face and said that in any case, the past couldn't be changed, and she helped him. After that, none of them said anything. The rest of the time that they walked on the beach, the two of them spent in silence because everyone felt a little awkward after that. They returned together when the sun had already begun to set behind the horizon. Rouvellian was the first to break their silence and said that he was going to make dinner and for the evening so she could calmly freshen up in front of him. Rosie, hearing this, was very surprised. She even raised her voice a little and asked if he really was going to cook dinner himself. She even emphasized that he was a duke. The girl thought that if the duke was going to cook, then people would definitely faint on the spot if they found out about it. She considered it something incredible, and therefore she really had a hard time believing that it was true. But the man was fully expecting such a reaction because everyone who heard about his title would react in a similar way. But smiling, he said that he wanted to demonstrate his culinary skills to her, so he really hoped that she would not object. In the end, she had to agree and allow him to do it. But she herself could not believe that the main character of this story knew how to cook, because this was definitely not mentioned in the original storyline. Rosie had absolutely no idea what was going on. However, she decided to think about it a little later, so after taking a shower and changing her clothes, she went downstairs where their wonderful dinner was already ready. After the girl tried it, she was delighted. She happily smiled and told the man that it was really great and the dish was delicious. Ruvelyan was very glad that she liked everything, so sitting next to her, as always, he could not take his eyes off her. He just sat and smiled, watching her eat. Then suddenly he could not contain his emotions and decided to cross the girl's boundaries a little. He put his arm around her shoulder and kissed her straight on the cheek. Rosie. Of course, she was very surprised when he did this. She was in a stupor for some time, so she allowed his lips to remain on her cheek. However, when she realized what was happening, Rosie immediately pushed him away from her and asked what he was doing. The girl herself thought about the fact that perhaps he had lost control of his magic again, although this time his gaze did not look crazy at all, and he did not have a fever. For a while after Rosie pushed him away from her, he just looked into her beautiful pink eyes, but then he dared and put his hand on her cheek, which was incredibly soft. Rosie had absolutely no idea what was going on. She also began to think that perhaps it was time to draw the final line. The girl had to explain the whole situation with him and send him back before her heart finally fell in love with this man, and she would not feel even more pain. So looking into his eyes, she asked, "When are you planning to return to the Duke of Roshan's estate?" The man, hearing this question, was sincerely amazed. He did not expect that she would even want to talk about it, so in a surprised voice he asked, "Does she really want him to leave?" Rosie realized that perhaps she had sounded rude, so she replied that it was not that simple. He had not been home for a long time, so everyone there was probably worried. The man interrupted her and said that he did not want to return to the Duke's estate at all, at least not now. Rosie, hearing this, was very shocked because it was really bad. But the man, after a short silence, said that he did not want to return because he had not yet found the way into her heart the way he wanted. The girl, hearing this, was shocked. She did not respond to it. She herself could not understand why it was so important for him, whether she understood him at all. But then she suddenly thought about the fact that perhaps he had some other motive, a hidden motive. And then suddenly one thought came to Rosie's mind, that he was kind to her only because he actually wanted something else from her. Before she could answer him, Ruvelyan suddenly stood up from his place and wanted to come closer to her, but the girl did not allow it. She also got up from her chair and said in a trembling voice that she felt unwell, so she should go to her room first and rest a little. After that, she started to run away and thanked him for the food he prepared. The girl said that everything was very tasty, and she was really glad that he took the initiative. She also advised His Highness to rest a little. After all, they had spent quite an active day together, so it could definitely do him good. After Rosie returned to her room, the first thing she did was fall on her bed and think about how she really wanted the rest of the evening to pass without any new incidents, because she couldn't stand it anymore. Then suddenly she heard her little dog start whining. She immediately looked at him and asked if he really wanted another circle of mana. In a sign of agreement, he barked. Then Rosie activated one of the circles with the help of magic, but after that, a whole multitude of others began to appear around her. Then the girl realized that most likely it was Adrian's hands, and this thought scared her incredibly. But in fact, it was a special message for the girl. It was simply sealed in a small magic ball. The ball began to burst, and then she heard Adrian's voice saying that it was him. He also said that his expedition did not take as long as everyone expected, and therefore in about 10 days he would return. As soon as the girl heard this, she was very shocked, of course. She did not expect that her brother would return so soon. After all, she had expected something completely different. But Adrian's message didn't end there. He also told her not to create any problems and to stay healthy until then. Rosie herself thought that she was now definitely doomed. After all, she hadn't done anything with the Ruvelians, and she even thought that perhaps Adrian would find out about this, and then it would definitely be the end for her. The girl also thought about the fact that perhaps she should have secretly contacted the Lashun Duchy through Ruvelian, but the man continued to refuse to go, and this created additional problems for her. She also had many questions about various details, for example, whether the Duke's servants even knew that he had disappeared and was living with the daughter of a rival family. Rosie was just in a panic. She thought that it was really a dramatic disaster. But in any case, she had to send a reply to Adrian, otherwise he would worry. So the girl created a magic ball and began to write a message there. She asked in a surprised voice if he would really return in 10 days. She also said that it was a little faster than she expected. However, she was still very happy that she would see her brother again very soon. She also said that everything was fine with her, and therefore he could not worry at all. Of course, she didn't like the sweet and fake voice she said all this in. But Rosie thought that he would like the last line, and he wouldn't be so picky about everything. The girl herself thought that she only had about 7 days left, so she had to keep her vigilance at maximum. Otherwise, everything would be bad. She also knew that she couldn't completely trust the rebellion because she couldn't understand whether he was pretending to be crazy or whether he really was, in either case, and she didn't like either option. But at that moment, she just needed to continue to doubt and closely monitor this person in order to quickly take the necessary measures if anything happened. She felt very sad because she was in the world of a romantic story. However, there was no romance around her. Instead, she had to worry about her life all the time and always think about what to do. And from that moment on, several hours passed and it was already completely dark outside. Rosie was lying with the window open, so she woke up because of the loud sound that the owl was making. The girl reluctantly opened her eyes and suddenly thought that she hadn't even noticed how she had fallen asleep in the first place. Last night was too emotional for her, so she just lay down on the bed and fell asleep. The girl also noticed something strange, namely that her bed was too hard. Then Rosie finally opened her eyes to check where she was, and the sight that appeared before her was very surprising. And all because she somehow lay on the Rebellion man, and he himself looked at her in surprise. His whole face turned red from embarrassment. The last of the long silence, he said that after she pushed him away at dinner, the girl for some reason continued to stretch their relationship between themselves, so he was completely confused. Because Rosie was still very sleepy, she even wondered if this was her room or if she was in the Duke's room. Ravalian, meanwhile, threw the girl to the other side of the bed and said that she had been like this since the moment they met. He lifted her head up so that their eyes could meet and said that she should have just let him die. However, now he would never let her go for sure. After this, the man, without waiting for any response from Rosie, took and unceremoniously kissed her on the lips. The girl tried to push away from him, but it was all useless. He continued to kiss her. Of course, she understood perfectly well that this man wanted her. However, she did not understand why, because she was not the best character in this story. Soon, Rosie finally managed to tear herself away from his lips, and she said that there was something she had been wondering about for a long time. The man smiled happily and said that of course she could ask this question. Then the girl asked if he had any experience before, because that kiss was too good for a beginner. Hearing this, he was very shocked for some time. He did not want to say anything at all. The man even blushed from such a question. He definitely did not expect such a thing. In order to finally understand her question correctly, he asked again what exactly she meant because he was not sure that he understood her correctly. Rosie explained in a completely calm voice that she meant whether he had experience in bed with anyone before. Only the men heard. This then became very angry. He abruptly grabbed her hand because of this. The girls even began to feel a little pain. She asked him to let go, however, he did not do this. Then in an incredible voice, he turned to Rosie and asked who she thought he was. Rosie didn't understand why he reacted like that. At some point, she even thought that he was angry. But then she noticed his worried look. With a voice trembling with fear, she said that he was a very popular duke, so that was exactly what she assumed. Ravalian, hearing this, was very shocked. He really felt incredibly offended that she could even think such a thing. Finally, after a silence, he told the girl that she was his only girlfriend. He also began to get even closer to her and said that he had never given himself to anyone before, so she was the first one he kissed. He touched his forehead to Rosalia's and said that she was the only one who ever mattered to him. Rosie felt very bad at that moment, seeing his upset look. She asked him for forgiveness for being rude and asking such questions. The man said that everything was fine, and he understood her perfectly, so she didn't need to apologize. The man explained that he was simply very concerned about the fact that he could not understand at what stage of the relationship they were, and because of this, he always felt somehow wrong. Rosie didn't like it at all. After all, they had returned to vague answers and questions again. She didn't know what to say to his words. She also didn't understand why Ravalian felt uneasy, so she turned to the Duke and asked why he was unconscious on the Hill family lands that evening. She believed that she had every right to know, So she asked him about it. The man looked at her in surprise for a while, as if he didn't understand why she needed these answers. This time Rosie wanted to have a real answer to this situation, so the girl was quite serious. For a while the Revillian remained silent. However, after that he asked in an anxious voice, "Is this really so important to her?" Rosie said that of course it was very important. She had to know how he ended up on her family's territory, because it was all incredibly strange. Then the man said that in fact he didn't think it was that important, and for that reason he wasn't going to tell anything. As soon as the girl heard this, she was very shocked and thought that he was incredibly impudent and shameless. But she really wanted to know the answer to her question, so she asked him to stop avoiding the question and finally answer her. Well, Revillian remained firm in his position. He said that in fact he remembered absolutely nothing. As soon as the girl heard this, she was very shocked. She asked how this was possible. The Duke then sighed heavily and said that he did not remember at all what had happened. But if she had not found him, he would certainly have already been dead. After that, he touched her hair and said that therefore, until he gets his memories back, he would not like to say goodbye to you at the Duke's estate because it could be a big problem for him in the end. Now Rosie at least understood why he was going to stay with her for quite a long time. However, the man suddenly moved closer to her and said that this time he could say with certainty that being close to the girl helped him bring back his memories. Therefore, Revillian carefully asked if she would allow him to touch and kiss her because it really helped him. At that moment, he grabbed Rosie by the waist and pulled her closer to him, after which he also whispered in her ear that he believed that being inside her would help him get everything back. Rosie understood that if he remembered as soon as possible, it would be to her advantage, because she had very little time left before her brother's arrival. So in the end, the girls had to agree to all his conditions, and after they finally did everything that was needed, Rosie fell asleep lying next to him on the bed. Revillian did not sleep for some time. He put his hand on her head and gently stroked her hair. This calmed him down. The man was pleased to remember what had happened between them, and it really made his cheeks even spread a little, because before he could not even imagine that something like this could happen. Rosie, meanwhile, while she was sleeping, even talked a little in her sleep. In a quiet voice, she said that she was hungry. And as soon as the man heard this, he laughed a little, and he thought that it was incredibly cute, and he liked the way she behaved in her sleep. But at that moment, the girl continued to speak. She suddenly called her brother's name, and upon hearing this, the man immediately frowned. Having heard about Adrian, he immediately began to have rather bad associations with this man. In fact, Adrian was the only person who was closer to Rosie than Revillian, and because of this, he was a little upset. The man believed that if he could, he would definitely erase all of Adrian Hill's memories of this girl and take her entirely for himself. However, unfortunately, he could not do this, and everything he wanted continued to remain just his dream. But he wanted to take the girl absolutely for himself and not share her with anyone else. He would like to possess her from the very beginning, and until the unknown end, he would like to know her absolutely and completely, because Rosie really appealed to him. He would like to know her heart, her soul. He was truly ready to live next to her all the life that lay ahead of her. Revillian would like to be with her in sorrow and in joy. However, he suddenly became interested in when this desire had become so deeply rooted in him. After all, he had never had such a strong desire before. But in fact, this happened long before the imperial banquet, 4 years ago. At the beginning of summer, when the lilacs in the castle of Rashiana were blooming beautifully with their color, it was on that day that this happened when, at the age of 13, he gave in to an impulse and simply ran away. That very day, nothing actually foreshadowed trouble. Initially, he was brought a birthday present from Count Andraco. But the man was not at all happy on his birthday, which was supposed to happen on the 25th of May. He knew that all the guests would look at him with such a pitiful look that he would just want to leave there. Eventually, Revillian wrote a reply in a letter of gratitude and handed it to the butler, telling him to send it. In fact, all the people at the event, in his opinion, would say something like, for example, a poor child whose both parents died on his birthday, and because of this, he felt even worse. He was not going to organize any kind of celebration at all. However, he could not help but do it. Revillian did not understand at all what kind of affection they expected from him for his parents, whom he had never even seen in his life, and therefore did not know why they pitied him at all. Absolutely everyone around just thinks that he is a good and quiet boy. However, in reality, it was all nonsense. The man dreamed of just one day spent away from this whole life that irritated him the most. And then suddenly the idea came to him that perhaps no one would blame him either if he did all this professionally and did not catch anyone's eye. He thought that he could really do it just once, at least to see what would come of it. No one should have given him a death sentence for something like that, so the guy wasn't too worried. And eventually that very day did happen when he escaped from the castle, leaving behind nothing but just one letter. At the same time, Ravalian used magic and transformed himself into a woman's form so that no one would notice or recognize him. Now he was a little girl with beautiful yellow hair and green eyes. He thought that it was on this day that everything began. His life changed into before and after. The first thing Ravalian did was go to the railway station in order to take a train to another place, because he did not want to walk around his city. That's when he was sitting in the carriage waiting for the train to leave. And suddenly he saw people who were just calmly passing by and didn't even suspect anything. The man also thought about the fact that the train he boarded was powered by magic crystals, and therefore it really should have been incredibly fast, which would of course have played into his hands. And soon he arrived at the Ava station in the southern part of the Duchy of Roshan. The guy got out there and went according to his plan. Then the man thought about the fact that in fact this territory was under the control of the Hill family, and he believed that in this place the Magi were definitely not his equal, so he did not worry. And so, while Ravalian was walking towards the beach in the area where he had been, he remembered the conversation he had heard from his servants. The butler, who was also his assistant, said that these idiots would see him as nothing more than precious objects for their tests. He also warned the boy that he was a rare case who was born with divine power and mana, so the people around him would try to grab him to use him as their prize specimen. But Ravalian was only ashes that everyone around him considered him incredibly weak. He was not at all afraid of such trash as the Hill family, from which the butler always protected him. The man warned the boy that they could really be dangerous, and that these people would be the first to want to take him as an experiment for themselves. And so, while the guy was walking along the beach, he suddenly reached the territory of a rather beautiful villa, so he decided to go closer in order to see who could live there. He approached the gate and felt a light aroma of roses that came to him from the garden. When he came closer and saw the flowers themselves, he thought that no one would bother him if he quietly made his way into the territory and simply admired these beautiful works of art. Ravalian jumped over the fence with the ease of a Ravalian. He thought that he could not imagine a magician who had a sense of romance. Therefore, he was really interested who could build such a beautiful villa, and even with a delightful garden near it. But the guy at that moment also thought about the fact that perhaps they specially decorated everything around beautifully in order to hide their sinister intentions and designs inside. And when he found himself on the territory of this estate, he began to walk along the garden, and when he went a little further, he saw a small gazebo in which a girl was sitting. In fact, this girl was Rosie. She was holding a book in her hands. However, due to the high air temperature, she fell asleep. As soon as Ravalian saw her, he could not take his eyes off her. He stood a few steps away from the girl and simply watched her. The guy immediately became incredibly curious about who she was. His cheeks even turned a little red because he was embarrassed, because he didn't expect to see such a beautiful girl that day. However, at that moment, a thought suddenly came to his mind that this girl could be the very daughter that the head of the Hill family had been hiding all this time. When he saw that the girl was holding a book in her hands, he thought that perhaps she was already studying dark magic or something like that. In order to double-check, he came closer and carefully took the book from the girl because he was really interested. And then Ravalian saw that it was not dark magic at all. It was a book with various desserts and other recipes. At first, he was a little surprised. However, then he smiled and thought that now all this caution seemed a little stupid to him because she was still a little girl. So it was quite obvious that it was still too early for her to study dark magic. Rosie, who in the meantime felt that the book had disappeared from her hands, began to wake up. And as soon as she opened her eyes, she saw some blonde stranger in front of her. She was a little surprised, but immediately stood up and did a little warm-up, because during all this time, her legs and arms had become quite numb. As soon as Ravalian saw this, he was very shocked. He did not understand at all what it did. And most importantly, why did he also already have doubts about whether she really was of aristocratic blood? But after the girl yawned, she looked at this stranger and asked who this girl was. Rosie also suggested that perhaps she was one of the maid's daughters who came this time and asked if her assumption was correct. But before Ravillon could answer anything, suddenly Rosie smiled an incredibly beautiful and sweet smile, saying that in the guise of a girl he was actually very handsome. The guy immediately became embarrassed upon hearing this. He didn't say anything to her. He just turned around and started running away, realizing that this wouldn't end well. Rosie was very surprised by what he did. She immediately started shouting after him and asking him to stop. She also tried to find out where he was running, but the guy didn't answer. In fact, he ran as fast as he could just to avoid talking to Rosie anymore and ended up going outside the estate. And eventually, even before the guy's birthday arrived, his summer vacation came to an end as quickly as the fact that they got back to the Russian duchy. In the end, it was also not an easy task for Ravillon to forget that girl who looked like a real beautiful rose. However, he believed that it should have been easy because he assumed that they would never meet again. And besides, he knew perfectly well that they were from different families that were at odds. So he simply had to erase her from his head, and eventually, he gradually began to succeed. However, 4 years and 3 months later, the guy suddenly received an invitation from Her Majesty the Empress. Of course, he was still not at all interested in all this. He assumed that they would again try to pair him with their youngest daughter. Therefore, he no longer even wanted to show up at the banquet to which he was invited. Then Ravillon opened the envelope and read the letter. The butler immediately asked if he would come to this banquet, and the guy sighed heavily and said that he simply had to do it. Then the butler replied that in that case he would then inform them so that the guy could prepare his official Ravillon outfit, and then thanked him. After this, the butler bowed and asked if there were any other instructions or if it was at the master's request. The guy thought about it at that moment, but then said that it was nothing special. He just wanted him to make the formal clothes blue. And so, when the day of the banquet finally arrived, Ravillon actually put on his beautiful dark blue suit, which looked perfect on him. As soon as he entered the event, he was surrounded by many girls. In fact, he heard that Adrian Hill and his younger sister were supposed to be present at this event. For this reason, the guy constantly looked around to see them first, and eventually soon, the door finally opened again. And then Adrian and his sister actually entered the banquet hall. They were announced and they walked a little ahead. Adrian, as always, looked incredibly angry and hostile. He didn't even smile when he greeted everyone. The man looked as if he didn't want to be at that event at all. As soon as the other girls heard who exactly entered the room, they immediately began to look at him and exchange glances. They were very happy that he finally showed up because he had not been at all the previous events, and then people noticed that there was a young, beautiful girl next to him. As soon as the Ravillon looked in their direction and saw Rosie, he couldn't hold back his excited smile. The girl was in a soft blue, beautiful ball gown that perfectly emphasized her hair and pink eyes. She was a little nervous, but she tried to hide it. In the end, as soon as he saw her in person, he realized that this was indeed the very same lady from his memories when they were still children. She was Rosalia Hill, a girl who was talking cheerfully to her brother, who still remained incredibly serious and gloomy. After greeting her, His Highness the Crown Prince suddenly approached her, bowed before Lady Rosania and greeted her. Rosie also greeted him, and the man said that he actually didn't expect Rosie to show up at the event. They chatted pleasantly for some time. However, after that, the Crown Prince invited the girl to the first dance. Of course, she had no right to refuse, so when the music started playing, they were in the middle of the ballroom and dancing. Ravillon, meanwhile, simply stood aside and watched all this with a very serious expression on his face. He didn't like it. However, he couldn't show it because he would be too suspicious. The man didn't understand why, after Adrian had carefully hidden her for all these years, he decided to show her at this particular event. He didn't understand why the guy didn't just hide her all the time so that he would never meet her again. It was incredibly painful for Ravillon to look at her now and understand that he would never be able to be with her. He was also very jealous of the girl towards the Crown Prince, and even thought about the fact that perhaps he should simply deprive this man of his title. The man stood for a while near the wall at the very end of the hall and realized that the thoughts he had in his head were really strange to him. Because of this, the man felt quite uncomfortable. However, he felt that someone was looking at him, so he turned his head to the side and saw that it was Adrian. At that moment, the man was not far from him and looked at Ravillon with his red eyes quite quickly, and it was ominous. Adrian I looked away from the Duke and pretended as if nothing had happened. But after that, for some reason, he suddenly began to smile. Rebellion followed his gaze to see what was making him so happy and saw that he was looking straight at his sister, who was continuing to chat pleasantly with the crown prince. Because of this, the man frowned again. He thought that it was very unpleasant for him to feel a connection with Adrian Hill. However, he had no choice after all. This was a public event. Then looking around the room, he noticed that many men were looking towards Rosalia and talking about something among themselves. This continued to throw him off balance, and at some point the man even thought that he needed to gouge out all their eyes so that they would stop staring at her like that. Meanwhile, Rosie had already finished talking and dancing with the crown prince, so she was about to go and find her brother in order to talk to him. But as soon as the girl took a few steps forward, she saw that some unfamiliar guy appeared in front of her. Their eyes met, and this eye contact continued for several minutes, after which the girl realized that it was too awkward and walked past the stranger. At that moment, Rosie thought that he really was incredibly handsome, and she already remembered who exactly he was according to the original plot of the story. Therefore, she felt even more pleased. Well, the man himself was incredibly angry because he didn't even say anything to her. In the end, he just stood there and watched as the girl Milo talked to her brother. People at the same time began to change their minds. One of the aristocrats said that some say that Adrian was of marriageable age, just like his sister. Another aristocrat, hearing about this, was very surprised. She looked at the man differently and because of this, continued to gossip. Ravalian, who was standing not far from them, heard all this and got a little angry after that. And he also heard how the other men were whispering, talking about how beautiful the girl was and how they would like to dance with her too. But fortunately, one of his acquaintances came up to him and said that everyone was so busy talking about the dazzling magic tower. The man Rada smiled again and said that the Hill family had no title and they were just a family that had power. So he thought it was all too unworthy and did not understand why the people around suddenly decided to discuss them. As soon as he did not hear a single answer from the Rouvillian, he thought that the man was very upset because of the Hill family. The man decided to cheer him up and said that the head of the family was the younger sister, and he thought that everyone was wrong because she looked quite beautiful and kind, but he thought that she was a completely different person. The aristocrat told the Duke that in any case, despite her beauty, she still remained a healer's mage, and therefore he did not understand how this girl could expect morality and dignity. Rouvillian couldn't listen to all this anymore, so he looked at his friend with an incredibly angry look and told him to shut his mouth already. The guy was very surprised when he heard this. However, he did not have time to ask what the Duke meant because he turned around and simply started to leave. And after the man returned to his estate after this event, he constantly read that cookbook that he once saw at Rosie's. The butler began to worry about him quite a lot. He even thought that the Duke was starting to go a little crazy because he didn't understand why he collected various decorations at all, as well as such strange books for him. However, this was not the strangest thing. What surprised the butler most was the fact that, of all the possible books about politics and battles, for some reason he chose culinary. But it also has desserts. The man began to seriously worry about the Duke's well-being and suggested that perhaps he simply became bored with life and for this reason decided to do something like this. And so some time passed from that moment. In May of the same year, Rouvillian also decided to renew the garden around his estate, and it began to look simply amazing. And despite the fact that the summer flower of Roshan has always been lilac, the man decided to change this tradition, and like an uninvited guest, a beautiful, delicate rose also appeared on this territory. After all the work in the garden was finished, the man was really incredibly happy that he decided to do it after all, because it really looked amazing. And at the sight of this rose, he immediately remembered that beautiful lady who filled his heart. And the more the man began to think about Rosie, the more he understood that he incredibly wanted to meet her, so he did not know how he could make their meeting happen, because it seemed completely impossible to him. But eventually soon he came up with one way and told the butler about it. The man, hearing what the master wanted from him, was sincerely amazed. But Rouvillian said that this damned Adrian Hill continued to ignore his letters. The butler, of course, having heard about who exactly his master was writing to, was very shocked. He did not understand for what reason he needed to contact him at all. The Duke, meanwhile, sighed heavily and said that it was not possible to deliver the letter directly to Rosie, and this greatly angered him for some reason. He had to act only through her brother. After that, he asked his assistant if there was such a possibility that the Archmage could hold his own younger sister captive, because this whole situation turned out to be really very suspicious to him. The butler tried to calm His Excellency and said that this was definitely impossible, and he was absolutely sure that everything was fine in their relationship. The man couldn't believe that Ruvelian really wanted to contact that very Hill family. But the guy then asked, was there really no way out at all? How to fix this whole situation? He said that his assistant was very smart, so he had hope for him. The man sighed heavily and wanted to say something. However, in the end, he remained silent. Then the Duke replied that he was a real idiot, because at that moment in the banquet hall, he was in a confused state, so he couldn't even talk to the girl. He also said that if he had known that this would happen, he would have at least tried to talk to her about something, but now he was left with only hopelessly trying to get through to her brother, who absolutely did not want anyone to get involved with her. But Ruvelian was not going to give up. He was very persistent and thought that he just needed to kidnap the girl, then he would definitely be able to contact her without any problems. His assistant, who continued to stand next to him, noticed that he had definitely gone crazy. Since such thoughts had appeared in his head, so in order not to provoke him even more, he simply decided not to express his opinion on this matter. And so from that moment on, some time passed, not too long, and eventually the Duke continued to move with a huge obsession towards Rose, and eventually found a way how he could meet her. However, he still had one small problem, and it was that he could not appear in that part of the Empire in human form because he would be immediately recognized. And so he turned into a dog. As soon as one of the little boys at the station saw him, he immediately told his mother that it was a wolf and was even a little scared. But the woman explained to her little son that it was not a wolf at all. Despite the fact that it looked like that, she explained that it was a breed of dog. The husband who was walking next to her was a little surprised and asked why in that case a dog of such a breed was completely alone. They assumed that most likely he was someone's pet, but the woman assumed that it was most likely a magical dog. In the end, the Ruvelian easily managed to leave the station almost unnoticed, and with the help of his impeccable memory, he reached the desired estate. Just like last time many years ago, he easily jumped over the fence and found himself already on the territory of the estate. In fact, Ruvelian knew that Rosie would spend her summer holidays in this place, because she did so every year. And he believed that if his guess was correct, then everything should go well. The man in the guise of a beautiful white dog walked through the already familiar garden, and he asked himself why he had not returned earlier, why he continued to try to get rid of this feeling that had appeared in him in relation to the rose. For him, it was all really strange. He thought that their meeting in any case had to happen sooner or later, and thus he simply lost a lot of time that he could have spent with her. When Ruvelian walked a little further, he noticed that there was absolutely no one on the estate's territory. He was interested in where she could be, so he headed toward the gazebo where he had met her for the first time. Well, she wasn't there either, and because of this, he was a little upset and thought about whether he would really never be able to meet her. However, then Ruvelian suddenly heard a familiar voice. Steps were getting closer and closer to him, and then raising his head, he saw in front of him the very girl he had been looking for so long. Rosie, who was actually at the estate during the summer holidays, saw the dog and was a little surprised because she didn't understand what he was doing there at all. When he saw the girl, he was simply stunned. He knew, of course, that she was incredibly beautiful. However, when she stood literally 2 steps away from him, he considered her the most beautiful lady in the whole wide world. Rosie had by this time overcome the small distance that was between them and was already reaching out to pet the dog. However, the guy got ahead of her. He lay down on the ground, thereby showing his belly. But after he did this, he then thought about what he had done, and most importantly, for which Ruvelian even became a little embarrassed and thought that this would be too much. Seeing this at first, she was a little surprised, but then she giggled and said that the dog was really quite kind and loving. Therefore, having sat down, she nevertheless scratched his belly as he had asked. At that moment, Ruvelian felt simply amazing because it was incredibly warm and soft. He really liked the way the girl decided to treat him. In fact, he even felt a little sad because he would like to feel her touch every day. At some point, he even thought that he wouldn't mind living in the body of a dog for the rest of his life if it meant being close to Rosie. After she scratched his belly, the girl began to think about how he got onto the estate. She even suggested that perhaps the door was open and he calmly walked in. As they continued to communicate, the men thought several times about whether he should just give in, and having turned into a human, finally show himself. But he quickly abandoned this idea because he understood that it could frighten her quite a lot, and in that case she would simply run away. Even though Revelian was in the form of a dog, if he gradually gets closer to the girl, then in that case he believes that when he opens up to her, it will not be so offensive and scary for her. The guy also thought that perhaps a kiss on the cheek would not be so impolite since he appeared in the form of a dog, and assumed that she would not consider it very rude. Well, he quickly abandoned this idea because he considered it too shameless on his part to act in such a way. They continued to play with each other, and then suddenly Revelian heard a familiar voice that belonged to Adrian. The man went out into the yard and saw that his sister was next to some dog. He asked what was wrong with her and where she came from. Hearing Adrian's voice, she greeted him and asked if he had already returned. Smiling, she said that this dog was very cute. She saw him when he was in their garden and suggested that most likely there was a hole in the wall, and that is how he got to them. Adrian looked incredibly angry. He immediately asked if the dog was really in the garden, but the girl, hearing his intonation, asked if it was really he who brought him along with him. But the guy said that in fact it wasn't him and asked, since when did he start keeping some stupid creature that he couldn't even persuade? So it was quite natural that he definitely didn't let him in. As soon as Revelian heard this, he was incredibly angry. Standing to the side, he began to growl. However, he tried to restrain his emotions as much as possible and continued listening to their conversation. Rosie at the same time turned to her brother and said that his spiritual beast also could not speak. However, he continued to keep it near him, so she did not understand his logic and claims. But Adrian explained that it was a magical animal, and that what she brought with her was a simple dog that was completely useless. At that moment, Revelian thought that perhaps the guy assumed that he was a person and not a dog, so for his own safety, he should have just left there. The man was well aware that if he was caught at the Hill family villa, everything would become even more complicated. And besides, Adrian Hill could notice him at first glance, so he had to leave there as soon as possible. Mentally, the man began to curse this person. However, after that, he turned around and began to run away from there as fast as he could. At that very moment, Adrian began to activate his magical abilities in order to simply take and destroy this dog because he saw no point in its existence. Rosie blocked his way. She started yelling at her brother and said that if he used it, the dog would not be able to survive and she would never forgive him for it. But at the moment when Adrian was about to fire his abilities towards the dog, he used his magical abilities and the sacred power was activated. As soon as the guy saw this, he was very shocked. He could not believe that it was really true. But fortunately, Ruvel still managed to escape from there and remain unnoticed. For some time, he remained in the form of a dog, and when he ran into the forest, he was able to transform into his natural state. The man stood not far from one of the trees and stopped and thought about the fact that Adrian called her by a special nickname, namely Rose, and he really liked it. He decided to remember this nickname for a long time because he thought that it suited the girl perfectly, and for this reason, he himself wanted to call her that. How time passed quite steadily, and from that moment, another 4 years passed. Revelian was constantly trying to track Rosie in some way, but he had difficulty doing so, and assumed that she had disappeared without a trace precisely because of Adrian, who had stepped up his methods of hiding her. And eventually it was quite hard for the man to accept the fact that he couldn't see her for all 4 years. So the guy slowly started to go crazy because he really felt genuine feelings for Rose. And so, when he stood by the window one fine day and watched his garden, he thought that if he never saw her again, then perhaps he would simply die because he could no longer stand this. He also quite often cursed Adrian Hill in his head because it was because of him that all this happened. The man decided that it would be best to get himself busy with work so that he would have fewer thoughts about this whole situation. But even so, it was hard for him not to think about Rosie, so he sent out countless formal offers. But all he got in return was an angry letter from Adrian. It said that if he wanted to appear dead at the wedding, then of course he could continue and ask to marry his sister. Everyone would be only happy about it. Of course, Revelian was very angry because he expected a completely different result. In the end, this letter was the first and last. He assumed that Rosie didn't even know about its existence because Adrian was quite stern. Quite often he wondered if he had ever missed someone so much before. It had lasted too long and intensely. He could not get the image of a girl he had met only a few times in his entire life out of his head. But soon one fine summer, one of his assistants came to him and said that Rosie would stay at the villa. Bowing to his help, he explained that Adrian Hill had to go to the South Seas in order to subdue the magical beasts, and Rosie, meanwhile, would also go to the villa. However, she would only remain on the estate grounds and would not go to study the beasts themselves. In fact, each of his assistants was well aware of the fact that if everything continued like this, their duke would simply lose his mind and it could end very badly. That's why he told the Ravelian that the girl would be alone, and that's why he even had a good chance to do what he wanted for so long. As soon as the guy heard this, he was sincerely happy and couldn't believe that he could really be so lucky. The man began to smile happily and thought that he would finally be able to meet his beautiful Rosalia Hill in person again. He was very interested in how much she had grown during all these 4 years that they had not seen each other, how much more beautiful she had now become, and his dear garden rose. And when he finally found himself on this territory, he could not control his magical abilities. His teacher always said that he could stop his instability, and all this time, it was under control until he turned 25. However, the man kept wondering why this terrible instability happened at that very moment. He couldn't even believe that he would die like this in front of her gates without even seeing her for the last time. However, then she finally came through a half-asleep state. He saw Rosie and was truly happy. All because this girl was his destiny and the dearest person in the world. So this is how a similar situation happened after they spent the night together. Rosie woke up after the sun was shining into her room, and because of this, she woke up. The girl sat up in bed and wondered what that sweet aroma was that was coming from the kitchen. She immediately became interested in what it was. But then suddenly she heard someone enter the room. It was Ravelian. He smiled happily and asked if she had finally woken up. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing there anyway. When he managed to get up after that, the girl asked what time it was anyway, because she thought that she had overslept. The man approached her closer and immediately said what time it was. At that moment, it was already almost 10 in the morning, but Rosie immediately asked him not to come closer to her and even stretched out her hands forward. Hearing this, the man was very surprised and asked why he shouldn't have come up. But the girl then screamed loudly and said that it was all because she was only wearing a nightgown that was too revealing. Because of this, she felt very uncomfortable. Ravelian immediately stopped upon hearing this. However, he was quite surprised because he didn't think that this could bother her. Then he suddenly smiled and asked her what she thought about them spending the whole day wearing nothing at all that day. He thought that it was a very good idea. As soon as Rosie heard this, she became even more indignant. She asked if he was really trying to make her die of shame. The man, hearing that she was embarrassed, was very surprised and asked if this was really true. She meanwhile continued to cover her body with a blanket so that he would not see anything, and said that of course she was very embarrassed by this whole situation, and he was only making it worse. But Ravelian, smiling happily, said that what she felt made this idea sound even better and more attractive. Rosie did not understand at all what he was talking about, and most importantly, why he only worsened the already strained relations between them. But in the meantime, he rather quickly approached Rose and, asking her for forgiveness, suddenly took her in his arms. After that, he moved her closer to him and, hugging her tightly, began to kiss the girl on the cheek. She was very embarrassed by this. The girl tried to push away from him and asked why he even approached the window while continuing to hold her in his arms. Ravelian didn't answer this. He just wanted her to wait for the right moment. Then they went out onto the balcony, and the girl saw what a beautiful view of the garden awaited her there. She saw beautiful, delicate roses that had finally blossomed, and an incredibly joyful smile appeared on her face. She couldn't take her eyes off this beautiful garden and said that this scent always lifted her spirits no matter when she smelled it. Hearing this, Ravelian smiled and asked if this was really true. The girl even laughed and answered that this was indeed the case. She did not know what it was connected with. However, this was a fact. Then Rosie suddenly turned her head in his direction and anxiously asked why he was looking at her that way. Smiling, Ravelian kissed her on the cheek again and said that it was all because she was an incredibly beautiful girl. Upon hearing this compliment, she became quite embarrassed again. After all, no one had ever said such things to her before. But seeing how she blushed, he laughed louder, then hugged the girl and began to kiss her on the lips. Rosie immediately screamed, and said that it was too early to repeat what they had at night and tried to push him away. But the man continued to kiss her and said that it was just a kiss, so she didn't have to worry about anything. While he was kissing the girl, he thought that Rosalia should just remain in this state, in the so-called blissful ignorance, and think of him only as a noble and righteous Duke Roshan. And all because he knew that if she found out who he really was, she would simply leave him and run away because she wouldn't want to be with a person like him. After the young couple had breakfast, they both decided to take a walk through this beautiful garden to enjoy the roses. Ravelian also prepared a special drink for the girl and asked if she liked it, lemon water. Rosie smiled happily and said that she was really beautiful. The girl herself thought about what was possible. Despite the fact that he was a rather famous duke, cooking was his hobby, and that is why he was so good at it. Rosie also assumed that no one from outside knew that Duke Roshan himself loved to cook. Then it would definitely spread throughout the empire because it would be the most shocking news. In order to diffuse the tense situation between them, Ravelian turned to the girl and asked if she had really not planted any other flowers in this garden. Rosie replied that she wasn't sure about that. The garden was decorated to her mother's taste, so she decided not to go there, but just take care of it so that the flowers wouldn't die. Ravelian, hearing about her mother, asked if she really meant the Lord, and the moon girl, hearing her mother's name, anxiously asked if he really knew something about her. The man said that of course it was so even before she became a wizard swordsman. After all, she was one of the most famous knights in the entire empire. Rosie was genuinely surprised because she couldn't believe that this man could actually know her mother. Of course, she knew perfectly well that her mother was an exceptional knight. However, that was a long time ago, and she thought that by that time everyone had already forgotten about her. But in the end, it turned out to be completely wrong. Rosie also knew that after she got married and became a wizard swordsman, she gained a bit of notoriety. As far as the girl remembered, her mother was rude, but she was not the type who would do anything evil to people. And besides, for Adrian and Rosie herself, she was always a loving and caring mother, so of course the girl could not think badly of her. When she talked to Rosie, she always called her her beautiful child. For some reason, the girl even missed her mother. She wondered if she was still alive. Rosie also quite often wondered if her mother was alive. Where was she, and what was she doing at that very moment? She was always interested in whether the woman thought about her children and whether she wanted to find them again. And while the girl was thinking about all this, Ravelian suddenly turned to her again and said that his master was the biological brother of Lord Ilunia. The girl, hearing this, was very surprised. She thought that, of course, her mother only said that she was the illegitimate child of some nobleman. However, she did not say that she had a brother at all. And even more so about the fact that her brother was a master of Ravelian. It was all very strange for the girl, and she could not believe that it was really true. So Rosie immediately asked the man what his master's name was. Then the guy, looking the girl straight in the eyes because they had stopped, because the conversation had become too serious, said that his master's name was Enrique Robbins. Rosie, hearing this, could not contain her surprise, and Ravelian explained that he was the younger brother of Margrave Robitz. Rosie was genuinely shocked because on the continent of Adasa, the Hill family was the most famous family of mages. However, the Roberts family was a prestigious house of sword art that produced only the best knights. And the difference between the two families was that Roberts was loyal to the imperial family, but the Hills were not loyal to anyone at all. And that's why they often said that they were not true nobles. However, the founder of the Hill family was, in fact, a member of the royal family. This means that their family was, after all, noble by blood. This remained an indisputable fact. But Rosie was incredibly surprised to learn that her mother was an illegitimate child of the Roberts family. However, this explained a lot about why she hid her origins so much, even to her own children. The girl knew that for the unyielding head of the Roberts family, having an illegitimate child was very unconventional, and accordingly, he simply could not accept this factor. Now the girls became even more interested in finding out how exactly her mother was born and whether she spent her childhood in the Roberts family, and also what happened to her later. Ravelian, who had been walking next to her silently all this time because the girl was deep in thought, noticed that her expression had become too worried, so taking her hand, he asked if everything was okay with her. The girl was a little surprised by his question, but she immediately said that he was fine. She really felt good, and also explained that she had just been thinking about her mother for a while. The man lowered his head and said that more than 15 years had passed since the disappearance of Loda and Looney, so it was no wonder that she was so worried about her. Rosie lowered her head down and said that it was indeed true. Her father still continued to try to find her. However, she did not know if they would ever be able to find her. The girl had long since lost hope. But then suddenly, when they approached the gazebo, the girl saw her favorite place and immediately stopped standing and ran straight to this beautiful bench. The man was a little confused when she started running so abruptly and immediately turned to her, asking if everything was okay. Smiling happily, Rosie invited him to sit next to her, and he eventually agreed to do so. In fact, this place meant a lot to the Ruvillian, and so he was happy that he could now be there next to the girl. She continued their previous conversation and asked if he really learned all the magic from his teacher, and also asked if he was a magician. Ravillon explained that they all called him a sage because, after all, he was both a magician and a wonderful knight. This girl was a little surprised. She thought about the fact that she did not see the point in calling him a sage because he was simply a magical swordsman. But she didn't argue with him about it and thought that Roshan's family didn't like titles like mage or magic swordsman, and so they decided to give their own title to such people, which was quite unusual. Rosie also thought that he really had a rather strange family. But for a while, she even forgot that this man who was sitting next to her was also a member of the Roshan family, namely even a duke. She wondered if Ravillon hated Hill's family as much as the rest of his family, since he had always treated her so kindly. However, she didn't know what his true intentions were. The girl was well aware that there was such a possibility that he simply saw himself as if everything was fine. But in fact, he could have completely different motives that could have a bad effect on Rose. The atmosphere between them changed, and the girl turned to him with a trembling voice and said that since she was also a member of the Hill family, she would like to ask him a question. Ravillon began to object to me. Then she looked him straight in the eyes and asked if he hated her. As soon as the guy heard this question, he looked at the girl with a serious look for some time, but then he couldn't help but laugh. He laughed for a while, and seeing her surprised expression, Ravillon explained that he must be crazy to hate her, so he didn't understand why she even suggested such a thing. Rosie, hearing this, was a little surprised. She expected to hear this answer. However, she did not think that it would be pleasant for her, and the girl asked, "Does this really mean that he does not like her?" Ravillon smiled his delightful and attractive smile and said that of course it was not so. Rosie responded in a quick voice that it was a great relief for her, but she herself was still very anxious and nervous. But then as soon as she said that it was a relief for her, Rosie immediately wondered why she had said it at all. She didn't know if it really mattered to her whether he liked her or hated her, because in any case they would soon have to part and never meet again. However, she really did. The bitter truth of Rosie was that she did not want to leave him and wondered whether these were true feelings for this man. In the end, she decided that she had to be realistic, and looking at him, she saw how delightful and handsome the Rovelian was, which made it even harder for her to think sensibly. Seeing his beautiful smile, she thought that he was incredibly cute and assumed that all these heightened feelings and complicated decisions were precisely because of his cute face. She already wanted to tell him something when suddenly Ravillon took the initiative. He grabbed the girl from Italy and, moving her closer to him, kissed her straight on the lips. This surprised her very much. She already wanted to push him away from her. However, she decided to give in to this impulse and responded to the kiss. Then she suddenly assumed that she would be incredibly nervous when he fell in love with the main character. Rosie was amazed. She thought about the fact that she was going to follow the path of a villain who was not even in the original story. However, with her actions and feelings, she does everything exactly like that. As soon as all these terrifying thoughts came into Rosie's head, she tried to get rid of them as quickly as possible because they only made the situation even more tense. Ravillon, who had already finished kissing her, turned to the girl and asked me if she would like to go further. The girl was a little surprised and immediately asked where exactly he was going to go. Ravillon then said that in fact he found himself in a slightly difficult situation after he kissed her. Rosie followed his gaze as it dropped down and realized what was the matter. Because of this, she felt too awkward, and she said that he was too full of energy and desire, since one kiss had caused him such trouble. The guy explained that he was 21 years old after all, and for this reason, such a reaction of the body was quite obvious. But Rosie replied that she did not think that the problem was age. However, she did not develop this topic further because it was too awkward to discuss. But Rebellion agreed with her and said that the real problem was not age, but that Rosie was too irresistible, and for this reason it was simply difficult for him to contain any emotions. The girl, hearing this, was incredibly shocked. She did not understand at all what he was talking about, and most importantly, why. But in the end, they still went back to the estate. At that very time, her brother Adrian was on the open sea. There was a strong storm raging there, and the lightning was quite frightening because at any moment it could hit his ship. However, the guy didn't worry about this at all. He went to the window and thought that they had already begun to approach the lair of the sea beast. Of course, his exact location remained unknown. However, he knew that they were indeed quite close, and he was very happy that Rosie had refused to go with him. The place he was heading to was incredibly dangerous, so taking her with him was out of the question. But the villa in that case was not the ideal sanctuary for her to be completely safe. Also, Adrian was quite worried about the issue that arose between him and the Rebellion, because he remained too persistent and quite often sent him letters asking to meet with his sister. He thought about the fact that perhaps the guy was some kind of madman and had completely forgotten who Adrian was. Of course, he had no intention of accepting this person into his family in any way. Even if the heavens opened up, he would still refuse to let Rosie be even a millimeter near him. Of course, everyone in the Empire knew that the Rachel and Hill families were fundamentally incompatible with each other. It was an ancient unspoken law that everyone had quietly observed for a long time, and for this reason, Adrian was going to return to the villa as soon as possible. The man was going to deal with this horrible sea monster within 2 or 3 days and then return home because he certainly couldn't let these ignorant fools covet what belonged to him. The man understood perfectly well that the Rouvillion would try to somehow contact the girl, so he needed to finish his expedition as soon as possible to prevent this. In fact, the man believed that if someone wanted Rosie, it meant that he was betting his life, and anyone who was not willing to offer his life as collateral was a useless person in his eyes. When the next day arrived, the sun had already begun to rise above the horizon, and Rosie woke up with the first songs of the birds. The girl thought that something bad had happened, so she immediately sat up in bed. However, she noticed that she had simply woken up from a bad dream. Then Rosie looked to the side and saw that she had woken up before the Rebellion did, and so she was very happy. After all, this was exactly what she needed. Last night there was something extraordinary. In fact, their bodies touched again, and the girl experienced unforgettable emotions for herself. Even just remembering the various moments when they were doing this, the girl was very embarrassed and tried to throw them out of her head as quickly as possible. Because of this, she began to feel very nervous. She thought about the fact that a person with such endurance is a truly terrible creature. Therefore, she needed to practice a little more in order to keep up with him. After Rosie left the bedroom, she went straight to the garden. The sun had not yet fully risen above the horizon, so it was light twilight. Walking slowly through the garden, she thought about the fact that perhaps she should have gone to the cliff coast with a man that day in order to change the picture a little. But then suddenly a thought came into her head that did not make her happy at all, because she remembered that Adrian could appear at any moment. Because of this, the girl was a little upset because she was walking around with such carefree thoughts when she should have been worrying about all this and finding a way out of the situation. However, she thought that she could afford at least one more day of freedom. Now Rosie could finally feel like a real human because she lived in the present and did not worry about everything that could happen. That morning, the girl was going to just walk around the garden and then start breakfast. Rosie thought about what she had to do to make it something simple, but at the same time a quick dish. And so, while the girl was walking through the garden, she suddenly felt like someone was looking at her. Because of this, Rosie became a little wary and immediately turned her head toward the rose bushes that were nearby. And then suddenly she saw a fair-haired guy who came out of the snack bar. He turned to Rosie and asked if he had said her name correctly. The girl nodded her head in agreement. However, the man looked rather suspicious. He began to approach her closer and said that for her alone it was probably very simple. The girl was very surprised. She did not understand at all what he meant. But the man said that the weak point of the master of the magic tower was, of course, she, and this information was quite useful. The girl frowned and immediately asked who had told him this information. However, for some reason, the man continued to smile. In a completely carefree voice, he said that it was quite obvious that the younger sister and the owner of the tower were very dear to her. Rosie wasn't going to show that she was very worried so easily. She put her hands on her hips and said that her brother was probably dear to her, but that didn't make her his weak spot. The girl even suggested that perhaps she should teach this impudent man a lesson and show that he was completely wrong. He invaded the Hill family property, and this could be considered legal self-defense. Therefore, the girl was very serious about teaching him a real lesson. The man, meanwhile, continued to smile and said that he was absolutely sure that she was his weakness. Otherwise, he would not have come. Rosie was not going to tolerate all this because now he had already begun to get personal and openly insult not only her brother, but also her. Therefore, the girl began to activate her magical abilities. However, she did not have time to deliver her blow when she suddenly felt that he grabbed her hand. Rosie was very surprised. She suddenly felt that she could not control her magic, as if it had simply been taken away from her. The girl panicked a lot and looked at the stranger. However, the man moved closer to her and said that her magic would definitely not work on him, so she shouldn't even try. Rosie was a little confused. She didn't even expect to hear such information, so in a trembling voice she asked what exactly he meant. The man continued to hold her wrist and said that he had a very rare disease and asked if she had never heard of anything like it. The girl, hearing about this, was amazed. She tried to remember the information she would know about a person who would have a rare disease with the help of which he had immunity to the magic of others. And then Rosie remembered that 3 years ago, shortly after Adrian became the master of the magic tower, there was a report about wizards who conducted experiments on living people. So they started their own investigation to understand what was going on, and eventually they found among the subjects many different small innocent children who were even forced to live in cages. And there Rosie saw exactly this man who at that time was still a small child. He had a very rare disease, immunity to magic, and therefore they remembered him for a long time. However, Rosie believed that this boy should have died a long time ago. She didn't know for sure whether it was the same child from the time when she and her brother found these children or whether it was someone else. Then she finally managed to pull her hand out of his palm. And the man said with disgusting ignorance in his voice that he hated all wizards and considered them to be real idiots. Looking Rosie straight in the eyes, he said that especially their boss, who was the owner of the magic tower, he brought him the most disgust and ruined his life. Smiling, he turned to the princess and said that she definitely had to be captured and come to his yard because he really wanted to see her crying and screaming, desperately looking for her magnificent brother. Rosie then asked what he was talking about when he said he wanted to take her prisoner. She was really very scared now. The man said that it was time for him to move out. He just needed to make sure that she was really in this place. So he took some device out of his pocket and activated it. Everything around him lit up. For a while, Rosie even closed her eyes because of this bright light. After everything was over, she looked to the side and saw that this stranger was no longer nearby. This man seemed to have disappeared. She thought that he hated wizards, but for some reason he still used the magic tool on her. It was incredibly strange and two-faced. She also thought about the words he said, namely that she would be captured and come to his yard. The girl was very alarmed by the fact that he thought that she would be captured. Then Rusia thought about the fact that since he didn't take her prisoner, then in that case someone else should have attacked her and taken her away. And then suddenly one thought came into her head, namely that this person who would steal her could be a Rovelian. Because of this, the girl was incredibly scared and alarmed. Soon she returned to the palace, where she was immediately met by a man who asked if she had really gone for a walk. He looked quite worried and explained that he was very worried when he woke up and saw that she was not there. But Rosie didn't answer this. She just looked at him with a distant gaze. The guy immediately realized that something was clearly wrong. The atmosphere between them was very wary. He already wanted to ask what happened, when suddenly the girl smiled happily and said that she was glad that he had already woken up. She tried to act natural, so she said that she was just about to start making breakfast so he could join her soon. But Rovelian didn't believe her fake smile. He immediately realized that something had happened. However, for some reason, she didn't want to tell him about it, and because of this, he felt a little sad. In order to help her a little, the man smiled happily and said that he would prepare breakfast for them so that she could rest a little. However, Rosie refused this offer and said that he always cooks. So on this day, she would like to do at least something. The man was about to say something, but Rosie smiled and replied that everything was fine. He could just rest, after which the smile slid off her face and she simply walked past him. Ravalian actually thought that he would have a little more time. However, now that he saw her reaction like that, he realized that he had to win her heart immediately. However, he also didn't understand why she had changed so suddenly. He couldn't just let her distance herself like that and leave. The Duke understood perfectly well that if he did not win Rosie's heart, she would simply die. That was all he had, so the man was incredibly serious. Of course, he could be with someone else, but he didn't even want to imagine all this. He would rather die than live his life with someone other than Rosie. However, he actually didn't want to die so early. After all, if he died, he would no longer have any time to spend with Rosie, so this option definitely didn't suit him. Besides, he believed that she would forget him after his death and meet some other man whom she would love with all her heart and create a family with. Of course, Ravalian was not happy with all this, so he was not going to allow it at any cost. The man came up to Rose from behind and reached out to touch her hair. He thought that he couldn't ruin this incredibly difficult chance for their relationship. The girl felt that someone was standing behind her, so when she turned around she saw the Duke in front of her. She was a little surprised and asked what he wanted. Smiling, Ravalian replied that he would like her to allow him to help, because together things would definitely go faster and they would have breakfast soon. Rosie finally let him do it. The man thought that if his magic got out of control again that evening, and if he found himself on the brink of death again, he wanted to know if she would just let him die, or Rosie would save him again, and this time he was no longer sure of anything, and for that reason he would really like to test this theory. And from that moment, several hours passed. The night finally began, and the Ravalian really felt bad. His magic was getting out of control. The man had a high fever. For several hours he could not fall asleep. Then he opened his eyes and heard someone enter the room. That person was Rosie. She came closer to him and said in a quiet voice that she knew it would happen again. The man couldn't even say anything. Tears were streaming down his cheeks. He began to think that perhaps he had died and thus gone to heaven. With difficulty, the Ravalian managed to sit up on the bed. He looked at the girl and simply began to pronounce her name in a quiet voice. He did not have the strength for anything at all. The girl at the same time took his cheeks in her palms and asked why he was crying, because she really did not understand and thought that he had become even worse than before. Ravalian looked at her for a while, after which he reached out to her closer to kiss her. However, before that, he asked why she had been avoiding him all this time. He also said that she had promised at the very beginning that she would help him. However, now she was afraid to even stand next to him. He did not understand at all what had happened, and most importantly, why. Rosie, as soon as she saw his expression, thought that if it weren't for his beautiful face, she definitely wouldn't have become so weak and stopped giving in to his manipulations. The girl felt very uncomfortable not having control over herself. Then suddenly the man hugged her tightly and asked her to help him again. He really felt just awful. After a short hug, he kissed him again. Rosie kissed him back and thought that of course she couldn't just let this man die when she could save him. All because she understood perfectly well what feelings she had for Ravalian, and it began to occupy quite a large part of her. Because of this, the girl realized the fact that she simply would not survive if this man died. However, she also assumed that perhaps Ravalian was not in his right mind. She believed that he could most likely pretend to have lost his mind in order to deceive her and ultimately kidnap her, just as that strange man who hated magicians had said. She was incredibly worried and did not know what she should do in this case and how to choose the right option for herself. But that evening, Rosie decided to help him anyway. They had physical contact, and after it was all over, the girl, lying on the bed, suddenly began to cry. Ravalian, who even after this could not take his eyes off her, suddenly asked anxiously what had happened, but the girl simply began to get out of bed and leave. She didn't answer him. She only thought that she had never been so confused in her life and didn't understand why this was happening to her of all people. Still crying, Rosie began to wipe away her tears and thought about why he had appeared and turned her whole world upside down. Ravalian was incredibly confused. He touched the girl and asked if he had really hurt her. And he said that if this was really the case, he would like her to tell him, and then he would correct himself. He was incredibly anxious. He began to wipe away her tears with his hands and asked her to stop crying and talk to him. In fact, Rosie thought about it until she was exhausted. She was wondering what kind of feelings she had for this person, since she had not fully figured out herself first of all. He was the first person who made her experience feelings that were completely unknown to her before, And because of this, she understood that she would always have a connection with him. And all because it was the first time in her life that she fell in love with someone. He was the first person who ever kissed her and hugged her in a special way. These feelings were really special because she kept wanting more. She could contact the duchy. However, she didn't do this. She didn't give it back to the estate. Rosie just continued to be near him. And all because she didn't want to part with him, she didn't want to say goodbye to Rebellion. She was simply very afraid that she would be the only one who regretted, the only one who would be sad after their separation, because she was not completely sure of the truth of his feelings for her. And now, after a while, everything became too confused. Rebellion did not understand why she continued to cry, so he turned to her and asked for forgiveness for everything possible. The man said that no matter what, he understands perfectly well that it is his fault, and he asks her for forgiveness because he is truly sorry. He couldn't stand to see her tears any longer, so he hugged Rosie tightly and asked her to stop crying and calm down because her smile was so beautiful. And at that moment when the girl was in his arms, she realized that in the end, the only thing she could do at that moment was either remain his hostage or stab the Rebellion in the back. Unfortunately, she had no third option. Eventually, she broke free from his embrace. The man did not understand at all what was happening. Rosie began to behave completely differently and did not explain anything to him. This was his very scarecrow. Obviously, Rosie wasn't going to just sit quietly and wait to be caught if he thought he had deceived her and gained the upper hand. Otherwise, he was very much mistaken. After all, it would be Rosie who would catch him and make him pay for everything he had done. Therefore, she turned to the man and asked if he had really approached her on purpose. Rebellion, hearing this question, was very surprised and asked what she had meant. The girl was already running out of patience. She started yelling at him and asked if he had fainted in the garden of the villa on purpose. She also asked if it was true that Adrian, who was her brother, had done something to him. Rosie continued to scream and asked, "Is that why you act like this?" Her hands were shaking with anger, but she wasn't going to back down. She was trying to do a good deed, and in the end, he just took and used her. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that there was no point in all this. She fell in love with someone she had only met once in her life. For her, this was completely stupid. Rebellion, having heard all her assumptions, was sincerely amazed. He looked at her for a while, and after that he simply sighed heavily. As soon as she saw his reaction, she thought that he must have been sinful after all, since he had reacted so calmly to her accusation. And that meant that all her assumptions were true. Rosie couldn't believe that she actually fell in love with such a mean and ignorant person like him. It was incredibly painful for her to realize this. After another short silence, Rebellion tried to say something. However, he could not muster up the courage. Therefore, he simply sat there, stuttering and silent. The man closed his eyes. He was even ashamed to look at Rosie. And she at the same time asked if it was true that all this time he was in his right mind and his magic did not get out of control. The man didn't answer this either. And Rosie asked if it was true that the memory loss he mentioned also turned out to be a lie. And absolutely everything that happened between them was a lie. Emotions overwhelmed the girl, and she could not hold them back. Rosie's tears welled up again. Then Rebellion seemed to wake up. He moved closer to her and looked straight into her eyes. The man said in a very serious voice, "I never used you, Rose. How could I ever do that to such a beautiful girl like you?" But she couldn't believe all these words. She said that it all always seemed very strange to her. "I keep crying." She said that he was a duke, but he acted as if he was her lover. So absolutely none of this made sense. But for some reason, Rosie kept convincing herself she hoped it would be true and that he really did have some feelings for her. But now that she knew the whole truth, she thought of it as an act. Then it all came together. In a very angry voice filled with disgust, Rosen said that of course there was no chance that he could have feelings for the daughter of his enemy, so that explained everything. Hearing this, he immediately began to protest. He said that all this was not a game. He really had real feelings for her and wanted her to believe in it. But interrupting him, Rosie said that she wanted him to tell her absolutely everything, but only honestly. At that moment, she got out of bed because she could no longer be near this man. Rosie activated her magical abilities in order to defend herself if necessary. She asked why he fell in her family's garden and why he was so kind to her. Tears were welling up in her eyes even faster, and Rosie said that she wanted to know every last detail without a single lie. She also explained that she had cast a special spell on him with which she would be able to notice even the smallest lie on his part. In fact, Rosie could use this magic a long time ago. However, she did not want to disturb the peace she had. And when the man continued to remain silent, she could not believe that even after everything she had told him and what he had tried to tell her, he would not want to tell her. And when she was about to leave, the man said that he was ready to really tell her everything, because she deserved to know the truth. Well, looking at her with an incredibly pitiful look in his beautiful green eyes, the Rovelian asked her to promise him just one thing before that. Rosie, hearing that he wanted some more promises from her, was very indignant. However, she still allowed him to say what he wanted. And then the man said, after you listen to everything, promise me that you don't hate me.